So how have you been, Yassir?
Alhamdulillah. How are you, Tanzim?
Yeah, I'm good. It was really coincidental how I bumped into you on Friday at the khutbah. What did you make of the Palestine khutbah that was run in the city? It was, what was the park called again? I'm new to...
Flagstaff, I think.
Yeah, Flagstaff, yeah. How did you find that?
It was mashallah. It was a very good turnout. I thought Brother and Sheikh Bilal's khutbah was mostly spot on. Yeah, so we needed to hear it. We needed to be next to one another, and it was good to see so many familiar faces. I think generally the turnout around and the solidarity around Palestine has been commendable and remarkable. I think a lot of us have put differences aside, and mostly we're united on this cause. So yeah, and that was reflected on Friday. So yeah, it was. How'd you find it?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I think it was a different experience for me because doing a khutbah in such a circumstance in an open field where a lot of people that work in the city and do that 9 to 5 with their suits and ties are like walking across the park, and then there's this big khutbah of like Muslims with beards and Arabs and brown people just all congregated, and it made them curious. So I think I was really observing more so the non-Muslims that were walking by. Not only I was a bit distracted throughout the khutbah. I was like just looking to like right and just seeing like a Lisa or an Anne or a Bill or a Bob walking by, and just like I actually had a funny experience. Because I took the train and I got off the train as this construction worker. It was like a white guy. He comes up to me. He's like, "What are all these what are you guys all here for? Like, what's happening here?" And I told him like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Palestine-Israel conflict and the situation of innocents dying in Gaza, etc. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I heard about it." And it's like, "Oh, that's so good that you're doing this." So I think on a general sense, a lot of people are aware and
that's it.
So,
SubhanAllah.
Yeah, solidarity.
I didn't. SubhanAllah. I think I didn't even think about that, man. I didn't even think about those outside of us observing us. It's really interesting because now that you mention it, I do wonder. Would you call it Susie and Bob? And wow.
Like, yeah, I just saw some like lady walking a dog along the park, and then there's a khutbah running.
I didn't register at all. I don't know, because I've been so... I mean, maybe because my workplace is almost entirely Muslim, and yeah, I don't know. I was a bit out of that. But yeah, it was, mashallah, there was a lot of people. I mean, I had the smart idea of putting my shoes next to a tree. I thought that would help me get it. But the only problem was that every other brother had the same idea. So, it was... throughout the last 2 weeks, I've seen many familiar faces that I haven't seen for a long, long time. And there's hugs and dua and, commitment from everyone that we want to not forget and raise our voices. So, Flagstaff was one of... many of those occasions, and as I said, the Sheikh's khutbah was loud, was clear, was on point, and was a reminder. And it's really interesting because I won't overdo it, but I think we're learning as a community how to speak through a double consciousness. In the sense, we learn how to keep safe and at the same time be political. It was something very hard for a lot of us doing in the early years of the war on terror, to be able to speak in two registers. So Can
you elaborate what the two registers are?
Well,
double consciousness.
Yeah, double consciousness. In a sense, we know we have a political voice, political hurt, political anger that's born out of the conditions and context of the world we've inherited, the Muslim Arab world. And you speak about that differently in different places. Yeah. Now, when you're speaking out in the open, in public, in media, in workplaces, sometimes our voices can't translate easily. Our hurt and pain has to be explained. And so we are also, because of the racialization of Muslims and Arabs in the last 20 years in particular, you're also wary of coming across as, angry Arab sort of thing. So you're aware of who you are, and you're aware of how they see you, and there's two consciousnesses here. And sometimes you have to talk in a particular way where I'm speaking to you, Tanzim, but I also know that they're listening, right? And we struggled with that because sometimes I would focus on them listening and neglect you, right? And sometimes I would focus on you, but then neglect the safety of how I might be framed, yeah?
So in the context, like, for example, would it be like you don't want to speak about jihad in a blunt way with non-Muslims compared to, obviously, like me and you, how we would talk about it? Yeah, well,
if you walk into a mosque and you're with people that you know and a language and a history that you're just going to... There's a local language. I'm not even talking about like, an Islamic language or an Arabic language, stresses, emphasis, things like that. But we have to be careful, not because we hide anything, not because we have, we're all closet jihadists or anything, right? It's none of that. It's just that we know that we will be very easily misinterpreted. Like they're looking for signs, and for our own safety, we sometimes have to, talk in ways that are more educational than assertive, right? So I thought he did it really well in the sense that, because we're, like you said, we're out in the open, we're in the city. There are
yeah, both from the construction side or like Bill from
there's all this gathering of effectively
Ernst and Young, yeah.
Like all these majority brown and black men, and yes, there were a lot of sisters there as well. So there's, and if you start, it's just something that I noted. I'm not sure how important it is, but yeah, it was a very good way to assert our concern, our solidarity, and at the same time not be alarmist. So,
I have a question. So I have a list of dot points we'll go through and we'll flesh that out, but I also want to keep it natural as possible because there's so much to unpack. Like there's so much, political conversations, this and that, racism and what we're talking about right now. But in your, what you are speaking about when it comes to making sure that we are having the right messaging and catering to non-Muslims, Muslims in the way we speak and all that sort of stuff, and how in the Jummah khutbah in the park, you're saying the Sheikh did a good job in doing that. In a political sense, right, I think there's always been that perhaps fixation on making sure that we're always saying things in a way that is palatable for the white non-Muslim. And sometimes I feel that the whole political project from different organizations can be just catering to those non-Muslims, whereas it's like a I don't know, it becomes difficult to work with. Like you want to like do that in the sense of conveying Islam in a positive way, but then it's like there's the other side where it's like we want to get as much power as possible to change the narrative. We can't just wait for the approval from the white person to make things work, right? So like one example that comes to mind from the Seerah, for example, you have Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, obviously, in the Makkah phase, people are converting to Islam, and then you have the Battle of Badr, Battle of Uhud, where even Sahaba may have killed their fathers, right? That were non-Muslims that didn't convert, and then there's that kind of narrative within the Meccan society that, oh, look at these Muslims, they're actually killing family members, all that sort of stuff. Like it's partly true, it's partly like obviously painting a bad false narrative, but that doesn't mean that we stop doing it in the sense of we know that we're trying to seek justice and doing it for the sake of Allah, all this sort of stuff, right? But obviously at the same time, Rasulullah was mindful of the political situation and those narratives. So whenever there was a situation where it's like, okay, this is going to be a bad, this is going to cause a bad image for the Muslims, he was, he was aware of that and tried to cater. So it's like, it's not black and white, but it's like, it's a delicate process. So I'm just like curious your thoughts regarding that in a modern context and a modern political context.
Well, I think you're right. There's been ways where we've catered too much to the mainstream audience at the expense of our message. Yeah, and we have to be assertive in that way. But I think there's a lot of stress on the speaker. I want to maybe shift now and talk about the stress on the listener. I think we as a community have changed, and perhaps politically advanced. Now we know that there is ways that we talk in this place because of the threat it may invoke to the speaker, right? It's the reality of living as a minority, and the example from the Sirah is a good one. There's time for messaging, there's time for coding, there's time for speaking loud and so forth. And a lot of people are of the view that politics is just the values that you hold, and inshallah those are grounded in the Sirah and our Deen, but they're also about the execution of your values: when, how, where, how loud, how softly, timing and so forth, right? So all of these are because we are engaging with others, and many of those others are not friendly, are waiting, are looking for excuses to jump on mistakes or affirmations that Islam is a threatening religion. And even if it were, a threat to modern liberal secular sensibilities, right? There's a way to articulate that threat that is inspiring and uplifting, and there's a way to articulate that threat where it comes back to attempt to silence you. So yeah, I just think when I was speaking about this double consciousness, I do think that we as a listener now are understanding it. I'll give you a somewhat silly example. I'm not praising or criticizing this, but when Muhammad Salah comes out and makes a video, everyone was like, before that, what's he going to say? Where is he, right? He comes out and he focuses on the humanitarian crisis and speaks about the need to provide, aid to that humanitarian crisis. Effectively kind of calls for a ceasefire and whatnot. Doesn't mention Palestine, doesn't mention Gaza, doesn't mention Israel, doesn't mention anything. I think all of us know why he can't mention those things. Yeah, and it's up to you now, from an act of generosity, to say, well, here's somebody who's said what he has to say in a particular way. We kind of gathered that he is on the side of at least the Palestinians in Gaza on the ground. Maybe we'd want more, but we also know that when you're in that context, there's not much you can say. That's fine from sports people, whatever. They're not going to be the ones. Now, political voices and Mashaykh have to do differently. They have to break the barrier. They have to mention Israel. They have to mention, and I think occupation, ethnic cleansing, all the rest. They should be saying these things. But I think if we go out there and notice other people in different contexts, we're less... we can be a little bit more forgiving. But if you've made your name, for instance, of doing politics, you're a supposed thinker or a da'i or so forth, there should be less excuses. I guess all I'm trying to say is, as we jump from position to position, place to place, we as a listener are starting to recognize there's ways to navigate this, and I think that's just an important part of doing politics.
Yeah, definitely, and we'll get into it. So in terms of what I also wanted to structure this in terms of response, and you also mentioned fixating on the listener as well and the speaker, and how we have to articulate ourselves and all that sort of stuff, because social media is a powerful tool, and the internet's a very powerful tool when it comes to changing the narrative and the discourse, all that sort of stuff. Everyone may have been hearing about the interviews done by Piers Morgan and bringing on pro-Palestinian voices, and the sort of recurring questions he's been asking all these Palestinian activists. So I wanted to do a sort of mock style interview. So I've actually listened to all of them again twice, to then jot down all the questions he keeps asking every question, every guest that comes on. And I want to get how you would answer that.
So you're going to pretend you're Piers Morgan?
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. So I'll put my Piers Morgan hat on and pretend that you have flown from Australia to UK. You've gone into Piers, wherever his studio is. I don't know where his studio is, probably in London somewhere. And you're like sitting right now in his studio about to do an interview with Piers Morgan. And I don't know if you're...
So I'm happy to do that, but I've got a couple of disclaimers before we go. But let me know when you're ready to start, and then I'll say the disclaimers.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready to start.
Okay, so happy to do it. No problem with it whatsoever. But I say this: I would never go on Piers Morgan's show, right?
Why not? What if you what if he sent you an email?
Allahu Alam. No, I don't think so.
What if
I
he's
don't
like,
know.
I was really impressed by your debate with Mohammed Gilan.
Now relax.
And I want you to come on.
I don't think so. Okay, the reason why I'm going to say that, look, Allahu Alam, what Allah plans for me, but in this moment, I don't think I would. But okay. I don't think I'd engage
for the sake of the ummah.
Calm down. I don't think I'd engage in mainstream media, full stop. I think that's my stance right now. That's why I've exited.
Why is that?
All right, I'll explain. Because I think the framing is as important as the conversation, but also I am not of the belief that I have to correct their narrative. And we can get into the politics around that later. I'm of the belief that we have to build our narrative. So I tend to focus on speaking in Muslim spaces outside of mainstream. I don't need social media for that. But let's go back a step. Also, I will speak to you in ways, like I said, and your audience is, I'm going to assume, is predominantly Muslim. I don't know, Allahu Alam, but let's just say it's a Muslim space, yeah? In ways that...
I mean, the comment section, maybe, I don't know, and the general viewing.
Yeah, so, but I'm happy to do this experiment because it also helps us answer back. Because even if we don't speak to them directly, their questions often frame the way we think about topics and we debate. Like somebody who watches the Piers Morgan interviews might be walking through their head, answering back all these questions. So I think it's a good thought experiment, a good way to frame this. But yeah, just a couple of disclaimers. I don't have faith in working through mainstream media. Personally, I don't think all of us should take the same approach. I do think there should be people out there in mainstream media. But my politics, what I'm about, I don't think there's much space for it in mainstream.
Okay, thank you for that disclaimer. Now we'll get into the Piers Morgan show. No?
All right.
All right, so yeah, just pretend you're sitting down, you're about to do an interview, you've flown from Australia to do this, and and we'll get into it, inshallah. So this is hard. I have to feel like I'm like, okay, I'll try to do it.
You have to feel like you're middle-aged white guy?
Racist, yeah.
All right.
Welcome back to the Piers Morgan Show. I'm your host, Piers Morgan, and today we have controversial CRT academic Yassir Morsi in the studio. Thank you for making your time to be here. So where were you when you heard about October the 7th, and what is your reaction to what happened?
First of all, Piers, I'm not controversial. I'm an Oxford graduate. I wish I could say that. No, sorry. Okay. Where was I on the 7th of October? I was home. What was my reaction? I got bits and pieces of information. I wasn't quite sure what was going on. Didn't quite understand it. But I guess to answer your question instinctively, my heart, prayers, thoughts went almost directly to the Palestinian people. As I know in the past, as a keen historian of this situation, that we collectively hold our breath because we know that Israel's response is always going to be disproportionate, violent, aggressive, and...
but the people that died today were Israelis. Why are you talking about the Palestinians?
I'm not. You asked me.
But you just mentioned about the Palestinians. Like, Israelis die.
Yeah.
It's like me saying, like, if, I don't know, Australian dies, I'm not going to start, talking about the people that did it, the deaths of the people that killed the Australians.
So I'll start again. I'm not talking about Israelis. I'm talking about Palestinians. That's right. But I'm not talking about the absence of care for the death of innocent people. It is precisely because innocent people are targeted that I call for a free Palestine. If your question, and I think it is, you're trying to frame this as where is my humanity in response to the killed Israelis.
So you don't think October 7th was a war crime, and what happened on October 7th to to Israelis.
A war crime?
Yeah, it is a war crime. It was
No.
one of the worst atrocities we've seen in recent past.
I don't think it's a war crime.
Why don't you think that's a war crime?
Because there was no war.
Innocent people that are party goers, that are nice and happy and peaceful people are dying. And it's not a war crime that such people were massacred brutally.
Yeah, it's not a war.
It is a war. Like, people died. That's the problem.
Yeah, well, you can call it different things, but a war is often between two states.
Hamas, who's a terrorist organization, killed these innocent people. And what's the go here? Like, why is it so hard for you to accept that it is a terrorist attack? Like, do you condemn the attacks by Hamas that occurred on October 7th?
Just pause for a second. You're doing a really good job, Tanzim, but I'm going to walk out in a minute. Sorry, let's go back to the... Ask your question in the same figure. Do you condemn the attacks by Hamas that occurred on October 7th? No.
Why not?
Are you willing to listen? Will you listen?
I am listening, but clearly someone that...
Okay. So if you give me a moment or two, I'll try and explain it to you without interruption. And maybe then you can move away from this moral indignation of trying to judge whether we as Muslims...
Well, clearly
Arabs,
all I've seen, I think the audience I've heard is you talking about innocents.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
That have died and not admitting the fact that they're innocents and they haven't died according to terrorist attack.
I've got no doubt you won't get it. I've got no doubt you don't understand it, but I'm asking you a different question now. Are you willing to understand it? Are you willing to...
I'm here. Like, I brought you on the show. Okay, go for it.
Yeah. The reason why many of us would not condemn Hamas in this space before you is because the media often operates on what we call a double bind. The double bind is as follows. When you ask me a question like, do you condemn Hamas? There's only two... Imagine this. Imagine you're driving down a road, right? And you want to turn left, but the road only gives you two options to turn right. That's the problem with this question. There's only two answers that we can give, and both answers center Israel. Let's say hypothetically that I refuse to condemn Hamas, right? What happens then? You get what you suspect, because there's a racial profiling of people like me. What's wrong with this person? Do they not care about the death of innocent people? Grandmas were kidnapped, babies were killed. This is horrific. When Christchurch happened, X, Y, and Z, and the whole debate gets infused with this moralizing about whether or not I have the right temperature, humanity, whether or not, and then if I don't, your audience will say, this is the problem with Arabs, this is the problem with Muslims. See, they are anti-Semitic, they don't care about dead kids and so forth. And so I have to navigate that minefield, because that minefield is narrowing down and framing the debate and discussion about whether or not my side has humanity. Now, let's say I recognize this, and the easiest way out of it is to say, yes, clearly I condemn Hamas. What happens next? So we again want to turn right, but we've only got one left turn to go. What happens when I condemn Hamas? Your next question, society's next question is, doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself? And so therefore, again, we get the whole debate framed around Israel. Now, we as Muslims and Arabs who have endured 20 years of the war on terror know that condemnations are used as weaponized narratives against us. We've condemned Al-Qaeda, we've condemned ISIS, we've condemned every terrorist attack, and none of them allowed the debate to bring forward context. See, I've condemned ISIS, but I'm almost like, well, let's talk about the context of the breakdown of Iraq and Syria. All you guys want to do is either see us as people who are either going to condemn or not condemn, so you can perform this good v bad Muslim thing. So the reason why we're resisting this is not because we lack humanity. It's because the framing of the discussion only ever allows us to center Israel, and we don't want to do that. We want to center the occupation. After you talk about occupation, then we can talk about the ills and problems and terroristic behaviors of Hamas in the context of occupation, not out of the blue.
That was, I mean, this is like, I haven't journeyed through this terrain. Like Piers Morgan show, they haven't asked these, they haven't got, like, he hasn't received such a response from the guests. So it's hard for me to ask a follow-up question. But I think maybe I'll
just go back into Piers. He would have interrupted me at least 3 or 4 times.
So I wanted to give you the chance to be able to articulate that point, because it's really important that, like, the way you gave that description of turning right and left, and then essentially that kind of narrative of centering the discussion around Israel.
We can go back to the Piers.
Centering around Israel, yeah.
Piers Morgan example, but this, going back to the earlier comment I made, this is part of the reason why I don't go to mainstream media. Because as I said, the framing is too difficult to navigate, right? Even if you hesitate, even if you don't immediately, loudly condemn, right? You're framed. And from that moment onwards, you have to defend yourself. And you see it. You're on the back foot. And people are like, why can't you? And so forth. And it's almost impossible to bring in context without that context being dismissed, because you're framed as somebody who's soft on terrorism, who can't see the evils of terrorism, right? And that's the racializing narrative. It's not even, you and I particularly, even though you're performing Piers Morgan's, we can't get away with it, bro. You're the wrong skin color. You're the wrong name. You can't go on TV and stutter your way through a condemnation, try to bring context without everybody thinking, hey, told you, deep down, they do support this. You can't. Yeah. So there's two ways. Either you've got a significant amount of reputation behind you, a body of work, right, and support, or, you don't go. And this is why I know you go back to the Piers Morgan, it's why the Bassem Youssef interview was successful, because it was just a short circuiting. He just disorientated.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that, like, because his use of satire, wouldn't you think that perhaps that's the way to approach those discussions, to break out of that sort of bind that you're in?
Yeah, so to go back, exactly, it broke. It's a short circuit. It broke the bind. I'm going to give you the answer you want. But in a way that everybody knows I'm not serious, because you're forcing me, because it's the absurdity of the debate, right? And so everybody's like recognizing two things. One, he's breaking free from the expectation of the performance as an Arab that he's supposed to do, right? And he's asserting his agency, his autonomy through humor, through sarcasm, and it worked, right?
So you would say it was successful?
Yeah, absolutely. It was successful because, it didn't, it broke that, I, Piers Morgan, am the observer of your morality. You, Bassem Youssef, as an Arab, are the observed. Let's test where your moral compass is. It broke that. Yeah. But I don't think many of us can do that. And Bassem can do it because he's a comedian, right? Not many of us can.
And it requires a certain skill that's a bit, it's not common as such. So it becomes, it was successful. It went so viral on social media. Everyone was onto it, and then there was clips around it. And I think for the most part, like even non-Muslims were able to see the absurdity to that, because Piers Morgan came across a certain way as well. So
yeah, I agree. I think it was successful.
It's a bit hard to get into Piers Morgan.
No, do it again, man. Do it again. Go
Actually?
Ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I don't mind. If it's what you want to do.
All right. So you have all these questions, and you've talked about me central, but it's all about me asking you a simple question about, if you condemn, but if you're not able to condemn, that's your prerogative. But essentially, I would have to ask you, like, how would you find peace in the Middle East? There's so much killing and bloodshed going on. You, as a Muslim that isn't able to condemn Hamas, how would you find peace in the Middle East?
Peace in the Middle East,
or in the areas of Israel and Gaza?
Well, I can answer both questions. So, peace in the Middle East should be built how on the self-determination and autonomy of the people of the Middle East, right? It should be what all of us want, and that is the freedom of mobility, the freedom of agency in the sense of expressing our culture, our worldview, and our religious orientation without punishment. These arenas have deep historical histories of conflict. It will take time, but at the moment.
But all areas around the world have conflict, but that doesn't mean that we can't, work towards something essentially. So when it comes to Israel and the Israelis suffering and the innocents dying as a result of Hamas, and don't you think that Israel have a right or a responsibility for a proportionate response to those attacks.
I don't think Israel...
Don't you think they have a right to defend themselves?
I don't think Israel is under threat.
Of course they are. They just had innocent
I do think
Israelis.
I do think in any given moment, many Israelis will live under threat, yes. But you asked me about the state of Israel. I don't think the state of Israel is under threat. I think if we were to draw a comparison between Palestinians and Israelis, Israelis are far more defended, have far more likely to have a better life, mobility and security than the Palestinians. So if I was to talk about this debate from the lens of creating peace between Israel and Palestine, the focus on Israeli security would not be part of my debate. The focus would be on Palestinian liberation. Israel is one of the 15th strongest army, has the US backing it. It has the Iron Dome. It has an air force, has a navy. It has an army. It has all.
But they're not going to Gaza killing innocent, party goers.
Yes, they are.
In the sense that,
well, maybe not party goers, sure, but they
peace-loving party goers. Mr. Yassir,
we don't know that. But yeah, look, all killing of innocent people is a tragedy, absolutely. But don't sit here and tell me that Israel isn't killing innocent Palestinians. That's not true.
But that's the result of conflict. There's war. That's what happens. So you have two people, two parties, one innocent get killed.
Piers,
they have a response to that.
It's not a war. People need to stop.
Of course.
It's not a war. It's not a conflict. It's an occupation and a resistance. If you want to use the word terrorism, fine.
What else?
It's not a war. How can it be a war? Who are the two sides of this war? Hamas. All right, let's talk about Hamas's air force. What's Hamas's air force? Gliders? What war? This is not a war. But also, have you seen the nature of the wall around Gaza? Have you seen the technology, the AI generated machine guns, the underground? They've even got ways to measuring if anybody's building tunnels underneath that. Gaza is one of the most spied on, securitized space imaginable, right? If we're going to talk about Israeli security...
But that's what it has to be.
If we're going to talk about Israeli security...
You have Hamas that are embedded into populations in innocent Palestinians in Gaza. Obviously, that's going to happen, right? They have to make sure they have to weed out those terrorists. So that's the only way they can do that.
Sure, but if we're going to talk about Israeli security, then we have to talk about what they're already doing and why it's not working, right? Because it's not a moment where we've just decided, right, today we're going to wake up and focus on Israeli security. They've been doing that ever since they dispossessed Palestinians of land. So Israeli security has been the centerpiece of this debate. Right? And yet what we should be asking is not, do they need more security? We should be asking, well, how is it that after 75 years, everything you've done is not working? Because the only true and meaningful security is Palestinian freedom. They don't want that. They won't give that. Because in their mind, Palestinian freedom, A, will take away what they see as Israel, and B, would put them in an insecurity. They would rather do this. They would rather oppress a people and try to control it as a way to gain security than try and take the risk of living side by side. Now, at the end of the day, you have to throw the question back at them. It hasn't worked. It's not working. They haven't gone anywhere. They're not going anywhere. You can try and destroy Hamas. So you're going to try and tell me that destroying entire generations of families and people, there's going to be no resentment, no hatred, no call or will within that people to want to hit you back? You can't. What are they going to bomb people into submission until one day they accept peace? It has never worked, and it will not work. So, if you want to talk about Israeli security, then Israeli security is deeply entrenched and intertwined with Palestinian freedom, but they don't see it that way. You and I should.
We have to end the show right there. We're running out of time. Sorry, but appreciate everyone listening. But yeah, I think I think
you're more generous than Piers. I don't think I would be allowed to.
Yeah, of course.
Continue.
I mean, I have to allow for the listeners to know what a good response is in terms of the questions being said. So if I just keep cutting you off, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, it's a terrible. I didn't even I wasn't even comfortable while you were. It was fake, but I still didn't like it because, you're under pressure to do two things: say your side of the story, but you can feel constantly that you're being maybe judged for being a wrong type of person. I just think it's so much harder for us to go out there and speak about terrorism and war, given our recent histories, without confirming in their minds certain stereotypes. Not that that's why I'm like, I don't care that they have them, but because I don't care, it's the reason why I don't go there. How'd you find it?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I think it's important that we have that understanding, and I think people who decide to go into the media and have these discussions have to be like really thorough with their responses and well thought out and prepared in that regard as well.
One thing we shouldn't do is get sucked into the moral debate. It's really, really saturated, and I understand the morality and ethics, especially around the killing of innocent people, is high priority, because maybe as a society, community, as any one of us, we want to remind ourselves what is right and from wrong, and but politics, and especially in this region, especially when it comes to the occupation of Palestine, it's a deeply historically complicated history that needs people to understand the basics first and foremost, and then the specifics secondly, and that requires to have done your homework. And many people, I think, are in the right place with their politics, but their homework needs a little work on, and that's fine. Not a time to criticize, but it's it would be better to try to bypass this moralizing of the issue, and from a Palestinian perspective, bring up dates, facts, events, occasions, where it articulates the nature of the occupation of Palestinians. That's the job. The job isn't to go out there and say they're worse than we are. You won't win that debate, because who's listening? People who are listening are more likely to say both sides are bad, because they're invested in the idea that they're a global humanistic sense. They don't take sides. They want the conflict to end. If you want to make visible that there are no two sides, you have to articulate the nature of what occupation is. And that requires understanding Palestinian history, Arab history, Israeli history. A lot of people, not a criticism, might need to do that a lot more than just coming out to condemn Israel.
So it's unfortunate how, as a Muslim community, we're put in the position where when big media outlets come, we have to think it through and be prepared and all that sort of stuff. But it's funny that the people that go on to those media outlets that side ideologically with those media outlets don't have to prepare nearly as good as the Muslims. So we have to be even more trained and equipped and polished, etc. But also, going to your point about the playing to humanity card, I actually wrote this down where I know that we spoke about it offline about this. So offline, you'd mentioned why do we as Muslims want them, Westerners, Israelis, to condemn? You mentioned this in the context of Muhammad Hijab trying to get Piers Morgan to condemn the innocent people that Israelis have killed. You said that it's a war. You choose your side. I choose mine. That's what you said offline. By asking the question, do you condemn? We're trying to play to this humanism that we care about but other sides and other people. You had said that this is not going to play into the Muslim favor because the Westerners don't care about us, the Muslims. You also highlighted, quote, what's going to happen when we get their condemnation and highlight the hypocrisy. Their condemnation, the sort of language they use, makes sense because they're using the racial profiling of the Arab and Muslim and other. They framed the debate as Palestinians having a terroristic, barbaric culture. Hence, what is the end game if we're trying to get into the interlocutors' condemnation, get them to be more humanistic, question mark. we don't believe that they are. So yeah, can you share more thoughts? And
so it's similar to what I'm saying. A couple of clarifications. So we're speaking about a particular type of audience, Piers Morgan's audience, I think, or those. No, so I don't believe that getting the other side to condemn Israel as a moral position is enough.
But that's like the common thing we do see online, like on social media as well. People are really sucked into that, like the like, why don't you condemn Israel? No, you condemn Hamas. And it's like that. Like,
yeah,
does that make sense?
I'm not. So I don't think it's enough. I don't know if that's the end game for us. I think my view of this is, now don't get me wrong, all condemnations of oppression, ethnic cleansing, occupation is welcomed, right? But I think our job isn't to fall into the trap of trying to argue about which side to condemn. I think our job is to fall into these narratives and create as much of what's going on the ground as possible, to relate as much, because the condemnation argument often sits on whose side are you on, and we have to break this idea that there's two sides. Right, we have to make visible the nature in which this conflict, quote unquote, it's not even the word conflict for me doesn't sound right. Right, so we have to explain this, because until that is part of the public debate, and it is. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not there, but when somebody asks you to condemn Hamas and you're like, well, why don't you condemn Israel? Right. I think that plays into the both sides argument, right? I think it's hard, but it's more important for us to try to, if we're going to get into these spaces, educate people on the nature of the occupation. The other part is, like I mentioned in that comment, a lot of these voices that are listening to you, they don't like you. It's just a reality. Like, I'm not saying it's all of the West, and that's not true, of course. I'm not saying it's all of the listeners, but there's a lot of people that just don't trust Muslims, that just don't trust or like Arabs. Yeah, I don't think it is what it is. It is what, like, there's a lot of people in our community who don't like other people. It is what it is. You'd like it to be different, but it isn't. It's part of the political terrain that we've inherited. Okay, now what we're going to do? I don't think it's worth much of your time to try to invest in people that don't like you. I think it's more important to invest in people that you can build up your own community, build their education about what's going on, so that they can have a strong sense of security. Being constantly on the defensive is tiring, right? So those two themes, if I can just repeat them, anyway, the first one is condemnation in and of itself is okay, but when it's a game of condemnation, when we get sucked into that game of condemnation, I don't think it helps us. It confirms and reaffirms that there's two sides and you have to choose which side you have to condemn. The second part of it is it's our job to facilitate and recognize that there is histories that need to be said out loud. And the third part of it is that you have to focus on audiences that you can build and create allyship with, or and if it's your own people, to educate them. In that sense, in the propaganda war part, right, it is a war of ideas between us. I mean, it's not a war on the ground. It's a war of ideas. And you've chosen your side. You've said, I'm pro-Israel, right? And I've chosen my side. I would say I'm pro-Palestine, pro-justice, pro-humanity, right? And because of that side, you have two obligations: an obligation to your own and an obligation, of course, to the Palestinian cause. You don't have an obligation to convince your haters. You just don't. It's a waste of time. Right? There's no reason for it. Yeah, it's very, very unlikely that they will change their mind anyway.
There might be another group that might say that, look, I don't want conflict on both sides. I want innocence to live and, do what they can do. Would they be classified? What are your thoughts?
They will hear, like, if they're not invested in and you want them to get invested, man. Just speak your truth. Speak it in the best possible way. Be the best version of yourself that you can be. Know your people's history. Know what's going on in Palestine. Platform the right Palestinian voices. Then the truth will come out. But if you get sucked into the debate between us versus you, who's worse, you're worse, I'm worse, then honestly, at the end of the day, I'm telling you, it's stacked against you. It won't work. Because you're reaffirming the idea that this is a conflict. Yeah, that this is a fight between in two cases, two bad people, bad groups. And, I'm not nearly as interested in profiling, focusing, debating what Hamas is or isn't. I'm more interested in talking about the way Palestinians live their lives due to occupation. And that's a more important preference for me. So I think the point is, I don't, in the hijab context that you brought up, I think he did kind of condemn, it did a light condemnation of Hamas. It wasn't an open condemnation. It was kind of like, we condemn all killing of innocent people and so forth, right? And that was enough for him to try to now say, well, Piers, do you condemn Israel? And then it went back and forward and this and that and so forth. And that backward and forward was a waste of time. Then Hijab, towards the end of the interview, does something really, really good, right? He says that the idea that Israel as an occupier has the right to defend itself is absurd. That's the narrative. That should be the narrative from the beginning, right? The middle part, you condemn, I condemn, you condemn, I condemn, is not going to get us anywhere, right? It should be about, let's talk about the realities of what occupied life looks like for the Palestinians and what resistance ought to look like.
So also on top of what you were saying regarding approaching the discussion, how we have how it's been depicted in the media, it's the bogeyman is Hamas, right? But from the reports we've seen, there was a coalition of groups that did the attack on October 7th. And yeah, Hamas is made out to be the bogeyman. What is the rationale you feel for the media to fixate constantly on Hamas to make them the bogeyman? Because
it's a form of moral disengagement. So even if you and I in this space or other space say we have a problem with Hamas because Hamas is terroristic or anything else, right? What I mean by moral disengagement is it allows so many people to ignore Israel's response, and prior to this, Israel's occupation of Palestine, right? So Hamas becomes some sort of magic pill we take where we can erase Palestinian history, context, reality, and focus on the evilness of Hamas, right? And therefore allow viewers, observers, and everybody else to morally disengage from the reality that Palestinian kids, women, men are being killed. And prior to that killing, right, or hospitals are being bombed, or schools are being bombed, the UN places of relief are being bombed. Hamas just provides that exit, that moral disengagement. Now, you're talking about being a coalition of various different resistance fighters, there's two complexities cannot be relayed here. Like Hamas just becomes a shorthand for a justification for the siege and blockade of Gaza, the general occupation of Palestinians, and the illegal war crimes that Israel is committing currently. We can just cover it all up by saying Hamas. So Hamas functions just as an object to allow this type of morally disengaged magical thinking. You don't have to think about it. You just say Hamas, and all of your consciousness around the lives of Palestinians disappears. And that's the function of it. So I don't think the nuances and the complexities of how it happened, who did it, and everything matters as much as presenting to the world that Israel is fighting a pure evil that doesn't need context to explain. It's just evil in and of itself. And the word Hamas becomes that.
Yeah, well, like in terms of so on top of that, when it comes to Piers also having that fixation on decontextualizing the attacks on October 7th and saying that the proportionate response from Israel would be in response to these attacks alone. Hence, the previous history regarding Palestine and Israel conflict is almost irrelevant. Well, so, what do you
it's
feel?
Ridiculous. It's ridiculous. That sounds to me like Piers trying to morally disengage from anything other than positioning himself as now, for whatever reason, scrutinizing this entire context through a starting point that is the 7th of October. It's ridiculous. They wouldn't do that for anything of their own history. Okay, so I think there was 250 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces early in the year, and a significant number of that were kids. And that's just one example of this year. But the idea that like we don't want to talk about context, what does that? Unpack what that means. That just means we don't want to talk about Palestinian suffering. That's all it means. And I've heard some strange things come out of this. Such as, this is the worst thing that's happened since the Holocaust and all the rest. It's almost as if like no history can occur between this event and the Holocaust, and any bringing up of that history is a kind of your inability to see Israeli or Jewish suffering. It's a strange framing. And I think it ought to be resisted. But it's ridiculous to say I don't want to talk about context.
What's interesting is my observation has been that whatever happens to Western societies become the marker of history. So I was talking to someone offline, and they actually they told me to ask you about like 9/11, and that's used as like a marker in history, post 9/11, pre 9/11, that's like whatever's happened to the Western world, a quote unquote atrocity. It's almost like that is used as like the definitive marker for us, for the rest of the world, right?
Well, in that sense, both what happened on the 7th of October and what happened in 9/11 are very similar. The world gets shocked because from them it just happened out of the blue, right? The second plane on 9/11, or even the first, but we know the second one because it was live. Comes from the edge of the TV frame. And where did that come from? Because they don't know the histories of their own state's aggression and how many bombs they've dropped on Muslim and Arab lands, or how they've propped up repressive regimes, and how our prison cells back home are full of resistance fighters, and how our none of that matters. None of it matters. What matters is their lives. Right? And when their lives are disrupted, and that's why, from the terrorist perspective, they figured it out. And it's not just September 11 or what happened in the first week of October. Terrorists know to get attention for their cause, you have to drag the West into it, right? And it's terrible, but you and I don't have to buy it. We don't have to. We can do two things, and I think anyone can do two things. I think you can condemn the killing of innocent people and talk about context. But what I think many of the people who frame this debate want to do is just talk about the killing of innocent people and erase the context. I don't think you and I would do one over the other. We want to do both, right? They only want one. They want to decontextualize it and say terrorism is an evil in and of itself and should be fought. Okay, so even if you would accept terrorism as an evil, right? For us, is where does this evil come from? Now, the problem is, if you don't answer that question, a lot of people think it comes from the fact that you're just Muslim. It comes from the Quran. It comes from Islam. It comes from, your anti-Semitism, right? So it really is in our interest to bring in context, because it's doing two things. One is pushing and fighting back against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, or any form of racial discrimination that tries to explain people's violence outside of context. It's in your heart. You just don't like them, right? You're full of hate. That doesn't help. And that, mind you, becomes a narrative and justification to continue bombing, right? Continue, and this is what I'm saying all the way going back to the start of this. The reason why we don't condemn is we learned something, right? Because if I am like, okay, if we explain to them the context, maybe we will realize that further bombing, further oppression will not help. It didn't work, because all they did was take your condemnation and ignore the context.
Is that consistent humanization, and essentially what you're talking about with Islamophobia, that we have to consistently fight when it comes to talking about these political discussions, right? It's like you're doing you're fighting like three battles in one when it should be one battle,
absolutely.
right?
But again, look, man, I don't know. Look, I want to be clear about this because I don't want to say that this is the only way. There are many, many different ways, and I show solidarity and support for all of us fighting this in different ways up until you join the other side and fight against us, right? And then that solidarity dissolves. We can flesh out what that looks like, but essentially I have respect for people who want to go out there, Piers Morgan, anything, and fight for Palestine. Okay, no problem. But I think it should be like, how do I say this? One avenue that we take, the main road that we should take is not that. The main road is we have to build our own institutions, our own media platforms, our own school, our own ways of educating ourselves. That's the main road. If our faith is built on trying to convince them, then a lot of that is going to be risky. You might convince people. You might convince a lot. Even if you convince them, the convincing might only last for a few before it collapses again. You have to build your own institutions. You have to build your own security, your own political bloc, your own party, everything. That self-determination, the ongoing reliance on convincing others about our history is difficult. And it's not even difficult because they lack humanity. It's just because no one's got the time for it. Like you mentioned something, like, I think Noam Chomsky said this. If I go on media and say democracy is what built racism, I sound crazy. What? This is a woke person. What's he on about? And if I was to unpack that, let's say I've got the truth on my side, I would need at least 5 minutes of uninterrupted airtime. You don't barely get that, right? Yeah. Now, and not only that, I would need to do it well. I would need to reference, and then maybe I would convince some people, right? And start the debate. Maybe. But on the other side, if I was to say democracy is the answer, I need 5 seconds. That's it. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to do it. Now, if you're debating somebody who's saying democracy is the solution versus democracy is a weapon against people of color or Arabs, right? You can't win that debate if you're both given 30 seconds. Right? You can't, because one is working on the collective public established opinion, and another one has to break that opinion, convince others. And when you add on top of all of that, you're racialized, you're walking with your kufi in your beard, right? It's very, very unlikely you're going to win that debate. And let's say you win it, then what? Guess what happens to the audience? They wake up and they go to work the next day. So for me, politically speaking, I'm like, you want to do that, but that's not the solution where we will find our self-determination. That comes through building up our communities, building up our worlds back where we are comfortable and safe in not having to spend all of our time trying to convince people, but instead trying to educate ourselves about how and what success looks like politically, spiritually, and so.
And it's kind of scary because like Zionism goes back so, especially in the Western context and the support it's gotten within, the political structures, political powers and able to wield itself, and then creation of Israel, all that sort of stuff was as a result of its, maneuvering of political power, its money, its influence, all that sort of stuff, and building it within communities and those ideas. So it's actually crazy how they're able to mobilize in that regard.
Well,
and then
let's pause there for a second. Zionism is Zionism. You know what? Let's even give. This may sound strange. It does sound strange, but forgive me. Just I'm doing this as a thought experiment. Give it begrudging respect, and what I mean by that is they're doing what's in their interest, right? Okay, what are you gonna do now, bro? What are you gonna do? Are you gonna continue to complain that Zionism succeeds? What are you going to do? You're going to complain that they lack humanity, that it is a racial profiling, Jewish supremacy. Okay, we've done all of that. There has to come a point where I believe, and we are doing it, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this hasn't happened, where our focus should be on less appealing to public consciousness, which is important, all right? But it is one avenue. The main avenue is to build, in our context that you're speaking, a Muslim consciousness. You've got 100 hours to give of public education. Give 90 of those hours to your kids. Right? That's it. I mean, Zionism is not going to change, man. It is what it is. They will continue to expand as long as they're successful. And our job is to resist it, yes, but also to build our self-determination. And that is where the tragedy is at. Because you know what? One of the heartbreaking things that we see that comes out of Gaza is when young, and it doesn't happen often, right? But it does happen when a young kid screams out, "Where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? Where are they?" Yeah? That is the failure. Okay? That's the failure. Let Israel be Israel. Why aren't we who we're supposed to be? That's the failure. And the reason why politically is that we lack self-determination. We lack it. So that's what you got to build, right? You have to build some form of breaking down the barriers that stops us from being free to express our politics, rather than ask them to be anything other than what they are. Okay, they will be. I mean, do both, do all of it. But I think the main road is for us to figure out and answer that question: where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? Where are they? And why?
So there's a lot to say there, because that self-determination that you're talking about, there can be a lot of conversation around that and how that looks like. So for example, people will say, like, there's a lot of Muslim countries, and because of economic situations, like people are talking about Turkey and Israel having some sort of relationship there, economically speaking, and but even though Erdogan has come out and talked about, condemned, Israel and their actions, there's also many things like with Egypt also involved inhibiting any sort of force that can resist Israel, because Israel have such ties, and the talk about normalization with Saudi Arabia, all that sort of stuff, that it inhibits us to do anything in that sense. So like if you're talking about from an institutional level, building things up from the ground, it's like that conversation about how does it translate across to the political sort of spectrum when it comes to resisting Israel, because it seems like everything that we have, it's like the hadith where it's like, Muslims would be like a sea of in the foam in the sea or something, and then pretty much there'll be so many Muslims but we can't do anything, but it seems like the powers that be is doing everything to stop that. So like you're talking about institutions, this and that, charity, but then it's like, how far does that go? It's just gonna Israel is gonna keep doing its thing, right? And then they have such power in that regard. So how do we, how does that self-determination even look like?
Well, first of all, it begins with a conversation. I don't think it will probably happen in our lifetime, but it must begin in a conversation. So I'm ask the question. Yeah. You can talk about Turkey, you can talk about Egypt, but in our lifetime, maybe I'm a bit older than you, man. I've seen what's happened to Afghanistan. I've seen what's happened to Iraq. I've seen what's happened to Syria. I've seen the rise of the Arab Spring and the quelling of the Arab Spring. I see now 100 million Egyptians living in very difficult economic situations. And all the time I've been seeing that, we've been seeing what's happening in Palestine, right? In our lifetime alone, right? And there's many, 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 many more that I can't list, right? We are, as hard as it is to take, people that cannot defend themselves as in the ways that we would like, right? We have to ask the question, why? That's it. We don't have to get to the answer just yet, but the question has to begin with that. When that young boy from Gaza is yelling, screaming, asking, where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? Where's the Arab world? Where's the Muslim world? That for me is a far more important question to have than whether or not Hamas is a terrorist organization. Because believe me, Hamas would not exist if we had strong armies in the region that were defending Palestinians. It would not exist. It just simply wouldn't. Now you have to ask why Sisi is the way he is. Okay, let's have that conversation. And we also have to ask why we can't. We also have to look at our previous failures, all of it. Now, I'm not saying it has to be the only conversation, right? But if we're looking for change, then the conversation shouldn't be, let's try and change Israel. The conversation should be, let's try and change ourselves. And I just think and I think a lot of people intuitively know this, but and there are times for this. I don't think now is the time to have that conversation. Now is the time to highlight what Israel is doing. But beyond this, I think that's the more important conversation to have.
Would you say that as a result of capitalism and in the sense of us being citizens of the state has neutralized us in a way where our whole perception of life and how we go about it is more in a self-centered sense, and then we're not able to mobilize in the way that we would like to in order to...
Yeah, there are many different reasons. Some are as, like you say, but others aren't. Some people can't support Palestine because their existence is at stake. Yeah. And some states need the funding or whatever. Like, I don't want to make it as simple as, they've sold out. There's different ways to sell out, but there's also we've developed a world where we're almost dependent on security and economic stability on those who help Israel, right? So there's many different reasons, but there's a general psychological principle that I think we should explore, not as a way to condemn one another, but to try to analyze our situation. We all care. I know this from working at a school. Everyone cares. We all care for Palestine, right? But it's really interesting to note where we stop caring. And that line of where we stop caring is different for different people. Some people stop caring up until it becomes uncomfortable in the staff room. That's it. They care until they have to say something in the staff room. And then I don't want to say anything because I'll be uncomfortable, right? Some people care up until I'll say it, but then I don't really want to lose my job. And they will say something in the staff room, but they won't push it. Some people care all the way, up until they won't lose or their career or economic well-being will be harmed. We all care. What we have to figure out is where the line is where we stop caring out loud.
Wouldn't you say it's dictated by whiteness, though?
It's dictated by, for us in this context, dictated by many, many, many different things. Now, what we need is to keep pushing that line. And the problem is we can't push that line unless we learn to defend ourselves, right? We learn it's my right to say this. Yeah. So a lot of us are walking around, especially in uni spaces and so forth, because we're worried that we'll be accused of anti-Semitism and so forth. And a lot of people are like, this means more to me. Let them accuse me. Others are quiet. Other people are like, I've made all these connections, all these friends, all these followers, and they're worried about it, right? Other people are worried about their own safety and security. Asia is going to give me a call, this and that. So the care is different at different level. Now we have to push that barometer further and further. So it's really hard because I'm looking at this call, where are the Arabs, where are the Muslims? And a lot of us, we care. We just don't know how to fight. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond because our dependency, our well-being, our paychecks, our social settings, right, have all dictated how we can mobilize. So we have to ask that question, how did we allow this? How? And if it isn't the case, how do we break it? Now, this is going to sound overly romantic. It's going to sound overly romantic and unfair. It's going to sound selfish even. But let's just say it and then correct it. The first victims of this are Palestinians. And they are occupied. But honestly, sometimes I heard this, I don't know, it was a tweet or something, and somebody said, I used to think Gazans were occupied and the rest of the Arab world were free. And now I know it's Gazans that are free and the rest of the Arab world is occupied. Right? That phrase, I don't want to over-romanticize it because I'm not living the life that people in Gaza are living. I don't want to make it sound like I'm the really imprisoned one and they're free, because that's a grotesque misrepresentation of the material reality, right? But there's a small seed of truth in this. The Palestinian cause can free you. It can free us, right? Because there is no clearer example of an injustice that we know about, and no clearer example of how they lie in media about it than this. It's not complicated for us. Yeah. And then it allows you to ask questions. Why am I silent? Why am I struggling? Why can't I say anything? And you know what? SubhanAllah, it's a lot better this time. A lot more people are saying a lot more things, right? It could be the result of social media. It could be the result because non-Muslims are involved and so forth. And the bar is shifting. Yeah. Stuff your contracts. Stuff your followers. Right? You know, seriously. And that has to happen. And that's the conversation that we in the West can have, right? But everyone cares. I'm you know, I'll go as far as saying deep down in some Zionists, they care about the conditions of Palestinians, but they will never say anything out loud because they care more about the Zionist narrative. And where does your care stop? It's a question we have to ask our community.
Yeah. I think in terms of, let's just take that a bit further when it comes to caring, and let's just say our threshold has, where would you want the threshold to be? Where would you want it to be when it comes to care? Where would the level look like for you?
For me, there should be no boundaries. You lose everything for freedom.
So we are willing to give up a material living.
But the problem is this:
in order to,
if there's only one of us,
that's how much we. Okay.
If there's only one of us or two of us that does it, it's meaningless because they'll get rid of us. We should all have this in our hearts. We are willing. We're either all free or none of us are free. We'll lose it all. You know, I'm not talking about doing anything illegal or anything like that, right? Yeah. But
double consciousness right now.
Right. But yeah, I'm willing to do it. Like if I lose my job, okay, so be it. But it can't be one or two people. It just can't. Because you know what the worst thing is? Let's say you're in a workplace and you refuse to take down your Free Palestine, whatever. You say, no, this is a global human conscious, this is ethnic cleansing and it has to be addressed. And they get rid of you and your job gets taken up by another Muslim. Do you know how that would make you feel? What was it for? Then they make you the problem. Right? So we have to push our entire community. If none of us are free, okay, it's either all of us are free or none of us are. Right? That's it.
Did you see the video of Khazmat calling for taking up the rifle and going to Palestine, the UFC fighter? Did you see that video?
Is that post-interview? Yeah.
Yeah, post-interview, yeah.
Yes.
So I actually took a lot of inspiration for the fact that he went on like one of the biggest, fighting arenas in the world in the institutional sense and saying that basically he's willing to do jihad. Like, I like, that's peak. Like, I don't know how many people would be willing to sort of...
Yeah, look...
And not caring about the repercussion.
The reality is, look, that's the thing. Like, we got to learn from our past, and we should have known this, and some of us knew this intuitively, and I'm not saying it's an unknown thing, but we have to learn that if we're going to keep playing the good v bad Muslim thing or the good v bad Arab, we're going to lose. We're going to lose. We have to build our community so there's a critical mass, yeah? A critical mass that makes it okay to say things like what you're saying, that we want to take up armed struggle against those who are killing us, right? Now, we want to do it legally, okay, we want our armies to do it, whatever, but the value that is, like, right now, bro, we are seeing how easy it is to kill Arabs, Palestinians, how easy it is. Right?
How easy to justify it as well, right?
Yeah, but it's done easily. It's a bang, 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 right? So forget the justification of the ideologies. There's no stand-in military to protect them. That's how easy it is. There's surrounding militaries are not doing anything. So beyond the justification and the ideology, we're seeing how easy it is for them to do it. Okay? So what has happened geopolitically, historically, for that to be allowed? Because every state, every people has something to defend their people, right? So that's the first thing. Then we get into this huge debate, and then we see from our own politicians how easy it is for them to justify it by saying Hamas, the hiding. Israel has a right to defend itself. So then there's an ideological defense of killing, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how did we get ourselves into this situation? Like, it's this easy to kill and justify. Okay, yes, but I want to be fair. There's a lot of people who are standing up against it, absolutely. And there are a defense, and alhamdulillah, true. Do I want to make it sound like there's no resistance? There is definitely resistance. Definitely. Right? And I think more than any other occasion, we have seen that resistance is growing. Yeah. But there are other questions we have to ask. How are we here? How is it that easy?
What are your thoughts about, because we're seeing a lot of protests around the world when it comes to taking action, relating to what we've been discussing, all the protests around the world, people are gathering together, marching down in huge, in thousands of people coming out in support. I've always, it's good that message is being sent in the media and social media goes viral to, show the support of for the people of Palestine. I think it's admirable and it's important. But I feel that for a lot of people, it's sort of like the end game in some sense, where it's like, we'll do this and we'll make a statement, and then I don't know. I don't feel like anyone sort of, no, sorry. I mean, some people don't go past that, and it's like, for me, going to protests years ago and this and that, I don't know. For me, it's like a real protest would be like just causing mayhem on the streets to the point where you have to hear out or, do, or I don't know, whatever it can be, make decisions by the powers of that country in order to appeal or appease those people to that extent. So for me, it's like, if we cause ruckus to that, I mean, BLM sort of happened in America and this and that, but that did cause change, right? But that's kind of how I envision it, rather than just going to a protest and then going home to our work the next day at 9 or 5. To me, that just doesn't compute. I mean, I'll go obviously for the sake of showing support, but it's just more to the point about the end game and where we go from there, and how some people have the perception of it's kind of the end. But it's to me, it's a bit of a contradiction in some sense, because it's
So in my interpretation of how the world is built and how power works and what we have inherited of call modernity, it was built on colonialism. The paradox that you're speaking about, your protest, then you have to go back to the day-to-day grind, in which in some cases your taxes are going to the government that further oppresses your people, right? That's our reality. What have we got in our capacity? Well, we have to now protest for me, and we're never about the end game, ever. They were about, firstly, psychologically, feeling that there are other people out there that feel what I'm feeling. Right? That's the first thing. You go there because there's a surrounding, and you want to see that little kid with the Palestinian scarf, right? You want to hear the words free Palestine. I don't think it's meant to. Maybe, hopefully, it can build awareness, build conscience. Now, I remember walking in the protest and seeing that the cops were stopping the traffic, right? And there was a lineup of cars. And I'm like, they're probably all pissed. Yeah. A lot of people will be like, oh, okay, right, but maybe it brings awareness. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I can't think through it. I can't figure it out. I just know that there's a time and a place for me to be able to yell out those words, free Palestine. How it lands, who listens to it, what it does, Allahu Alam, victories from God. I don't know. Sometimes it's hearing, you get inspired. Sometimes you walk away. Now, if you ask me, will the majority of people who are protesting go back to their normal lives? Almost all of us will go back to our normal lives. Will we stop caring? I don't think so. Will some of us stop speaking? Possibly. All of these different things. But your struggle, if I can put it this way, is to spend the remainder of your life in one way or another fighting for the liberation of the oppressed. You don't have to do that through protests every day. You can do that through educating yourself, reading a book. You could do that by charity work. You can do that by never looking away, always thinking, what can I give? Right? How much can I give? Just constantly build it up so that our next generation will have it easier than we have. Right? And their next generation will have it easier than they had. That's it. That's all we've got. I don't think, unless something radically changes, yeah, right? I hope so. I pray so. I can imagine something radically happening, but if the status quo remains, it's very, very unlikely. But we don't stop fighting because they don't stop fighting, right? So, and even as I say that, my heart hurts. Inshallah, it's the case. I hope it's liberated. I hope I get to see it. I really, really do, right? But the world is built in a particular way right now, and I think our obligation and duty is to keep fighting without focusing on what the end game is. We fight because it's the right thing to do.
When it comes to, I think a lot of us, I mean, when I speak about they aren't or we aren't doing enough, I'm also thinking about myself. Like when you are talking about the level of care, I'm trying to think about where my level of care is at. And so it's an introspection exercise for me as well in that regard. But in saying that, when it comes to the ideological front, what we were discussing, when we talk about Israel's actions and the power that they have, all that sort of stuff, right? We had in places of power, Muslims, politicians, like, because there's always that school of thought, like in the way we were discussing, how do we fight back or get that power, where that level of care is at. People do it through different means. So like going through democratic process, being in elections, that sort of stuff, raising awareness, right? So a lot of Muslim politicians like Ilhan Omar, who were publicly speaking about Palestine before, have taken a neutral stance, quote unquote neutral stance. And in saying that though, in the flip side, there's a lot of politicians I've read from UK that have resigned from the Labour Party because they felt that the Labour Party weren't supporting the Palestinian cause, which is commendable to an extent. And there's also another video that was doing the rounds with Albanese supporting the Palestinian cause. Like it was like a grainy footage of him way back in the day as well. And now he's kind of taking a neutral stance as well. Can you explain this neutral stance perspective and why that happens?
I'm pretty sure I've heard Ilhan Omar speak out for a ceasefire and condemn.
I'm not across that.
Yeah, and condemn her government's and Biden's inability to call for a ceasefire. The neutral stance thing. Yeah, look, history won't judge you well, right? History won't look back on you if you have taken a neutral stance in this and refuse to stand up against what is a clear act of excessive aggression in the context of occupation. I don't think anyone should be taking a neutral stance, obviously. Are you asking me why they do it? Well, as I said, power is power, man. It works in a particular way. If you own your own means of well-being, your own financial means, you're more likely to speak out. If you don't own those things, then you have to navigate it, because as I said, there's a point where care is stops because it has to, right? We don't want it to, but that's the reality of it.
So, on top of how we navigate it, and we're talking about more so in a general sense of fighting oppression, showing our level of care, mobilizing, all that sort of stuff, and self-determination. In saying that, we have and we're well aware that many different faith groups will be involved in the Palestinian cause. Naturally, it could be like liberals, Christians, Shias, Sunnis, etc. Right? What is your opinion about all these faith groups and people with different ideological leanings coming together for the Palestinian cause? Because why I asked that question as a follow-up question, people will come together in order to speak out against oppression, but then when you follow it up with how we do it or how we look to progress further, there could be people saying that no, because, and people in Palestine or Palestinian politicians as well have said that, like, because Israel haven't given them a proper democratic process, or one that isn't riddled with Israelis getting involved in it, therefore will be able to be in a lot better position. So they're appealing to democracy, right? And then there may be Muslims, Orthodox will be appealing to Islamic rule and Khilafah, that kind of sloganeering, right? And different faith groups have different ways of approaching what liberation looks like, is what I'm saying. So, like, how would you go about that kind of terrain of things?
First and foremost, it ought not to sound strange, but it often does.
Because it becomes difficult because, like, we're Muslim and we're trying to, like, do everything Islamically, quote unquote, right? You might have problems with that terminology in that sense because we don't want to secularize.
I don't look. I don't have a problem. Look, as long as we live, there will be different groups of people who have different ideas of how we should do our politics. When it comes to Palestine, I think Palestinians need to lead the conversation on the ground, those who live in Palestine, about what their future looks like, what they want. And they have, and it's there. And yes, there's the lack of democratic processes, but of course there's going to be context within Palestine. Now, you're asking about us, who are beyond that. Is there an Islamic Palestine versus a secular Palestine versus a democratic Palestine versus a Muslim democratic Palestine? All these various different questions. It's a good question in that we have to recognize that solutions are political contests. It feels like, how about we get the power first and then figure out how to distribute it? But many people don't trust. So I know you haven't mentioned it, but your question kind of alludes to the fact that there's been debates online and in person. What does queers for Palestine look like? What does that mean? What does that off-put and this and that? Would they survive in Gaza? X, Y, and Z. Yeah. I do think these contests are important, but there's a baseline. The baseline is that we should, all of us, come together and commit to a global agreement that all occupation, genocide, and all of the rest is not part of that contest. Right? So we can debate and dispute what Palestine ought to look like, but we must all come to agreement that the eradication of Palestine is not part of the debate. Right? So, sure. I also think these contests will always take place, and Muslims have to have and be part of that conversation. I don't agree that we exclude ourselves from any alliances with secular or other faith groups that are pushing for a free Palestine, because most of that free Palestine is just an attempt to resist occupation and the eradication of Palestinians. In this current moment, that's welcome, that's needed, that's necessary. Once we get a free Palestine, then Palestinians can decide how that looks like, right? And they already have. So I just want to make it sound like there's that debate has been going on and on and on and on and on, and there will always be conflict, always be contest, always be negotiation. That's part and parcel of politics.
In terms of also steering the conversation onto Israel, right, and their actions and why they do the killings and genocide to the degree that they're doing it and trying to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, right? Are the actions of Israel, what would you boil down the actions of Israel to? Would it just be racism? Would it just be a result of liberalism, secularism ideas? Or is it an extension of colonization? And I just wanted to get your...
Yeah, so Israel is a settler colonial state that's built on an idea of what Zionism is, and they have to navigate and negotiate their own population and their contest. They have various different political orientations around how Zionism should operate. There is a consensus sometimes, and sometimes there isn't, about how to treat Gaza, Palestine, occupied territories. If you ask me, I think free in Palestine will also mean free in Israel from being an occupier and oppressor. And I think that is a big necessity for peace. right? Because right now there is a logic in Zionism that is at least articulated. The one I received that's built on dispossession, whether it's through settlements, whether it's through dispossessing Palestinians from history, right to testimony, dispossessing them from life and well-being, right? It is in its current manifestation, Zionism is a dispossessive force and a violent force, and in its current status quo, the amount of violence required to maintain Israel is too big of a price, firstly for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. And Israel at the moment is unsustainable. And it has to see that. And that it doesn't at times is tragic, firstly for Palestinians, but also for themselves. It's just unsustainable. It can't continue. Right? And maybe the world is changing. You know, this sounds weird, but let me go through this. Really, when I was growing up, and maybe this was the generation, my father's generation, my uncles and aunties and so forth, they had this, of course, hurt, pain, anger, sometimes hatred for what Israel is and has done to Arabs. And, you know, my background is Egyptian, so there's wars are lost there, right? And so forth. But there was this begrudging respect that Israel was strong and mighty, and their propaganda machine was incredible, and their intelligence services was beyond this world, right? And maybe it was them coping with defeat, so they made the victor sound more powerful. And me, I'm looking, Israel doesn't look strong. Israel looks weak. It may have a military as stronger than, but like their propaganda is so thin. You can see straight through it. Right? The intelligence service clearly now, for all else intents and purposes, 7th of October is many different things, but it's also a failure from Israeli intelligence. Right? It's a failure. So, and also the fact that they need to annihilate, destroy Gaza, cut off electricity, destroy infrastructure before they can move in on the ground, is a concession that they know they can't win on the ground without that. And the fact that they need the United States of America to continually push back, globally or elsewhere, their narrative. Me growing up, I'm like, they're not that strong. They're not that strong. They're morally weak in this position. Of course, they're always going to have their supporters, and those supporters are going to be for various different reasons. Some built on Islamophobia, some built on love of Israel, some built on geopolitical alliances, of course. But I think when you're beyond all of that, you look at some of the kind of myths that they're promoting, and you think, how are they so bad at this? Their lies are really clearly obvious lies, right? But, and I guess maybe the world, maybe Allahu Alam, I hope so, maybe the world is expanding. Maybe social media has created different terrains. Maybe we're seeing things differently. And I'll end on this point. Israel has to have this conversation where it recognizes that its violence is simply unsustainable and it cannot continue this.
You know what's interesting? We talked offline. You actually mentioned that when it comes to propaganda and the way, like, for example, they try to make Hamas the bogeyman, and the way that they talk about Palestinians, they're trying to induce that warmongering spirit in that regard, in global sense as well. And so you also mentioned that it doesn't feel like, Israel have to try to lie too hard regarding beheadings and tortures, like all that narrative, like, we know it's largely debunked at this point, like Hamas were doing beheadings, and babies were being killed, and they will trace that to a news site where they interviewed a lady, and she just kind of mentioned in passing that an IDF soldier told her. There's no real source backed to that. And I guess the follow-up question is, like, those babies that were beheaded, where are the mourning mothers? We want to know the identities, but it's not traceable, right? So then there's also the one about the hospital in Gaza that got bombed essentially into smithereens, and innocents who died, and they're trying to blame it on Hamas as well. All these sort of things, and they're trying to concoct these evidences to try to support their view, and people can see right through it. It's pretty silly, right? But
so the details
they have to try too hard, right?
The details we'll never know, and it's sometimes ugly for us to try to debate about whether or not babies were beheaded or not. It doesn't feel right. Yeah, but that's the kind of context and the political narrative that draws you into it. Like, are you really going to debate this? Are you really going to deny this? But the lie that I was speaking about, the bigger lie, I guess, is the idea that Palestinians and Hamas hate them because they're Jewish. That's the bigger lie for me. I think it's quite clear that their actions, their occupation, their dispossession, their displacement, their killing, their imprisoning, and many, many, many different ways they've dehumanized Palestinians is the factor why Palestinians and others hate the state of Israel for what it's doing. And if hate is too strong a word, don't trust Israel for what it's doing. And if trust is not the major concern, okay, recognize that it is Israel that is violent. All of these things is built often as one way or another, it being our lack of sensibility or care for the Jewish right to self-determination and security, or anti-Semitism. And I think that is being questioned significantly these days. But there are details as well which they lie about. You mentioned various different things. It's not the first hospital. There are various different examples throughout our history where we see the targeting in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Syria, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, right? The point that you made before about how it's easy to lie, yeah, I think their successes in the past is now becoming their failure. And what I mean by that, it was so easy just to say terrorism and the world would believe them, but now it's a lot harder to prove.
Yeah, so when it comes to that, like going back, I know we talked about the dehumanization in that regard of Arabs and Muslims. I would like to get you to discuss that also historically and link that to Edward Said's thoughts and perspectives when it comes to having those sentiments already existing in society, and people use that to justify killings and oppression, all that sort of stuff by the colonizing forces as well. So just wanted to get your thoughts how deep that is, or how that runs.
I mean, Edward Said's work will always remain relevant, partly because he articulated very, very clearly what it meant to be a Palestinian in exile, and the various different ideological, cultural ways imperialism props itself up, from the institutions of universities to the media to the narratives that are created. We do live in a different time than the one Edward Said grew up in. I don't think we should underestimate. I mean, there's good and bad in this. I don't want to glorify it either. We now have anyone with a camera, phone, can be a journalist. Right? We have various different voices, ways to measure. Now, look, social media has also increased their ability to lie and promote fake news or propaganda as well. So it's not one way, right? But it's harder to control the narrative, right? And I think there's some benefit in that. We do, like, for example, me going online, I don't know if it's just me or the way the algorithms work or whatnot. I see a lot of infographics and cartoons from the Israeli side. Yeah. From the Palestinian side, I see actual dead babies. Yeah. I see actual destruction. And so if that's what I'm seeing, maybe others are seeing it as well. It's very, very hard to erase that from public consciousness. These images we're seeing buildings be destroyed. We're seeing parents pull kids out of rubble, right? We're seeing the funerals in Gaza. So I think somebody from there said we have 6 prayers a day. The 5 that are fard and the janazah prayer, right? So we, in this sense, Said's articulation of the way power creates culture and how culture is built on imperialism and creates the self and other. We see it. But I do think that all of us who have inherited Sage Project need to recognize that the terrain is a little bit more different. And I don't think their propaganda and their discursive narratives are as strong as they were during Said's time. Hopefully that is one pathway to liberation. But yeah, like we have to, I guess, nod our heads and pay tribute to the likes of Said and others who helped us see. And yeah, we have to continue that fight.
And so how important is decolonizing the mind?
I'm so tired of this word right now. I think it's been taken... Look, whatever decolonizing is, if it means escaping and exiting the dominant narrative, okay. But for me, I've always been... My politics has always remained materially orientated. And what I mean by that, I don't dismiss or recognize that we have a spiritual, intellectual project where we have to liberate our heart from all that the dunya has created. And maybe that's our first and foremost project, to return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wholeheartedly. And yes... But materially, politics is often about the redistribution of opportunity and wealth and security. And sometimes I feel like decolonizing the mind comes at the expense of decolonizing, full stop. Right? Which means, like I said, I said this in a talk, and this is changing, mind you, and this is awesome. Like now people are boycotting Disney and Starbucks and so forth. I mean, it's just the beginning, but... if our entire well-being in the West is built on the exploitation of developing world or third world labor, what do you do? Who cares if you decolonize in your mind? You just sound good. Who cares? Like who cares if you're anti-racist and anti-Islamophobia if you're not conscious of how your coffee that you're drinking, in which you're doing your anti-Islamophobia, came to be? Who cares? At one point, it just becomes another first world indulgence. I'm a good person. So I'm so over it, because I'm like, it has to be tied to the liberation of people in the developing world, in the colonizing countries. If all you want is a safer place at your university, all right. But if that's it, if it ends there, if you want a safer place to bring up what's happening, the violence that we are collectively doing, me and you, right? That's a different project. So decolonizing for me has become often a sexy word for some people. And I don't like that, because it's violent. It's ugly. It's about liberating material conditions in which people live their lives. And if you're not willing to say that, get out of the way.
And what's your thoughts about the whole movement of boycotting Israeli products? Like Starbucks is a famous one. I think Chemist Warehouse as well. I keep saying that to everyone, and particularly like the females, and because everyone needs to get this stuff from Chemist Warehouse, and
I'm for it, 100% for it.
So we should try to do that, because it kind of flows into your point about the coffee and where it comes from, and the exploitation and the oppression.
Absolutely, I will never, ever, ever buy anything from Starbucks again, ever. I mean, look, I can't say never. Allahu alam. My intention, and when I say never, because you never know what happens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests you in different ways, accidentally, otherwise. I am fully committed to never buying anything from Starbucks. I cancelled my Disney subscription yesterday.
Disney Plus?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't even have
Disney Plus. I'm for it. I'm absolutely 100% for it. Even like, if you're going to ask me a question, will it impact anything? I don't know. From a position of pure conscience, I cannot be this contradictory in my politics. I cannot want the liberation of Palestine and somehow let my money go to people who are supporting their oppressors. It's bad enough that my taxes are going to that, right? In a roundabout way. Okay, God knows how Muslims or Palestinians are doing it in America when they know that their taxes are going to the part of it is going to the IDF. God knows. Like, it must be so difficult. The least we can do is this. Absolutely, I'm for it. Yeah, but then the thing is, our job is to build alternatives, right? It's what happens next when we find out that Apple, you're going to get rid of the Apple. Like if it constant, and this is when the care factor starts to be tested. Yeah. And so do as much as you can. Especially luxury items. Yeah. And then hopefully invest even by words into businesses that support. And also, who needs Starbucks, man? You don't need it. Right? Like it's also, I found that the pumpkin spice is not made of pumpkin, and I'm so embarrassed. I kind of feel like it's an appropriation of Somali tea. Like, I don't know. It's just so ridiculous. But yeah, I'm for it 100%. So, but not just look. You need to be an ethical consumer, man. You need to know where your t-shirts are coming from, where your shoes are coming from. Yeah, you need to know this stuff because these are the real reasons why war happens. They all lie and tell you it's about Jews hating Arabs, or but it's fundamentally grounded in an economic imperative to make some people live in the world through security, and therefore correlatively and consequently, a bunch of us live in insecurity. We need to do that. There's no politics beyond that.
But people might make the argument about, like, if it comes to clothing and being an ethical consumer, that the options that are quote unquote ethical are expensive, and so for people that are struggling, it becomes difficult. Does that make sense? So like,
yeah, and not only that, we support, like, if you pull out because a Bengali sweatshop is exploiting young Bengali workers, and you're like, well, we're still paying them, right? So we're still giving them money. They're still relying. They don't want us. Yeah. So let me be clear about this. This is a conversation we need to have. It has to be centered. This conversation needs to occur. The outcomes of that conversation should lead to more ethical consumerism. What that ethical consumerism looks like, we don't know yet. But it has to be had. It's a hidden part of this. Now, if you can't afford it, or it's do you? There's no. I'm not this Puritan who says you have to be 100% like this or 0% or you don't count. But I do believe that if we're going to talk about decolonisation and political resistance, this part of it has to be spoken about. And hopefully that will lead to alternatives. Hopefully. Bring it out in the open. Lead it to alternatives, right? Because right now, the way we are effectively built is to be consumers and to create things that others consume. And it's a big part of the way the modernity is built. So figure that out. Figure out how much of your consumption and the things you're consuming is going to the very oppression that you want to oppose.
And in terms of, in the context, I know you give that example of the coffee being produced and the exploitation that goes into it. And therefore, is it, I guess, the conversations that don't get had within the masajid or the sheikhs, unfortunately, is about these sort of topics when it comes to exploitation. Or I remember the one example you gave about the football being kicked around by the Pakistani.
I'll say it again. It's controversial. I know it is. I'll stick to it and I'll say it again. Part of the problem with our mashaykh, part of the problem with traditionalists, neo or otherwise, is they may not realize it or otherwise. They're too secular. They don't. When we say the word secular, they think that means that you adhere to an epistemology. I've got no doubt that their epistemology, their sources of knowledge, their sources of their voice is grounded in the Quran and Sunnah and the text, and they're fully committed as believers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're doing all in there what's required for them to become closer and better Muslims. This is not a condemnation of that at all. When I say they're too secular, it could be even accidentally. My point is, secularism allows religious expressions in certain formations. One of the things that it allows is the self-development narrative of improving yourself spiritually, of improving yourself, on focusing on who you are, on the quietism and so forth, right? On the idea of ultimately religion not playing a disruptive role in society to break down political institutions. Okay. it plays more of a sermonizing role, a guiding role, and so forth. There are various different ways we can explore this. But part of the reason why when they come out and there's just a moral voice about what is right and what is wrong, what is Islamic and what is un-Islamic, if it's just that moral voice, that facilitates the role that secularism allows for religion. But if we have an Islamic analysis, right? An Islamic analysis is something completely different. Interpret for me what this means. Interpret for me what consumerism is, and then allow it to try to impact society. Interpret for me what colonialism is, what racism is, right? And I'm not saying it's not out there. It's definitely out there. But it's not as dominant as the moralizing voice. And the moralizing voice is, I saw a TikTok about a brother telling us that we shouldn't protest, right? Because it's not part of the Quran and Sunnah. Whatever your views are, this moralizing voice for me is, okay, that's fine. Now give me an Islamic, right, analysis of modern life and resistance. Just give me, and I'm not saying you can't or there isn't. Promote that. I'm not saying you haven't heard of one. Lead with that. Promote that. The moralizing voice of don't go out there, stuff like that, is a dominant voice. Just it can be infused into the analysis, and it's for that reason I just sometimes feel like, accidentally or otherwise, Islam sometimes is used as a handbrake, right? It's to pull people back from doing politics, and the result of that is often you will find the alternative is Islamism and various different forms of Islamists and so forth. And then we have this internal conflict, right? I do think that the mainstream Muslim community needs to provide for its next generation a deeply epistemological Islamic analysis of our being, of how we exist politically. And again, I'm not saying it's not there. I just don't hear it often. Every khutbah I go to, almost every, like 7 or 8 out of 10, is a set of dictations of what you should and shouldn't do. Not an analysis of what is going on, how things are playing out.
I think to be the devil's advocate, the perspective that would be coming in is because we have to follow the Quran and Sunnah and the Hadith, and that we want to get into Jannah, and therefore every action we do, we have to have that taqwa and make the correct action in order to please Allah. Therefore, people go to the texts or the Quranic ayah and Hadith in order to make the right decisions in right moments. So like they're seeing a situation, for example, in a detail-oriented sense, like in a detailed sense on a protest. So people are like, okay, is this permissible? Will Allah be pleased with this? And therefore they go to text and they make they deduce their ruling or whatever, and then they act on it. If that makes sense.
Absolutely fine. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
No problem with that. And of course, but what's missing here?
Like you talked about, the way forward, the action, like giving the Islamic project to drive us forward. That component's missing.
That analysis of what to do based on what's happening is as important a voice of saying, protests they're not part of our tradition, they're not grounded in the seerah, they're not from the Quran and Sunnah. Okay. But when this is occurring and this is happening, I mean, maybe it's out there, maybe it hasn't come my way. I find it hard to hear it. And that is an analysis of how basically to interpret power, mobilize people for resistance against ethnic cleansing. Powerful voices about dua are very, very important, and I'm a believer of that. What else is there? And it's not just create a solution. That's what I'm saying. The solution part is the analysis. What's going on? What's happening? Tell me. Explain it to me. Provide it for me. And I think the secularizing part is because it's so much easier to be a moral guide. It's easier to say what's right or wrong. It's harder to evoke from an Islamic textual tradition a way to analyze power. That's I think a harder project, and that's the project that I think we need to get into. What does it mean to wear sneakers when we know that somebody unseen down the chain is not being paid or has been exploited, not being paid enough or being exploited by working conditions? What does it mean? Now, you can say it's wrong, sure. But why is it happening? And how does one resist it? And I do think Islam has to fulfill that void as well. I don't think it's okay, we know it's wrong or it's right. There has to be an analysis. And again, I've got to be clear. I'm sure there is. It's not, I'm just saying it's not the leading voice that we get very often, And it's important that the Mashaykh and every other student of knowledge start, for a lack of a better phrase, building an Islamic humanities that isn't just one that tells us what Islam is or isn't saying, but what Islam can help us explain. And I think that is there, but not as dominant. In my view, I don't know. I could be totally...
I mean, I think an example that comes to mind is, like we're talking about the shoes. There are people that will say and discuss that we can't use pig leather, obviously, in shoes, and there's those rulings and this and that. But what you talked about is, for example, the consequences of utilizing shoes that are being produced in a way it's exploiting people, and the rulings on that. Yeah. And because I think we become too individualistic in our outlook in terms of personal deeds, but they're not seeing how...
let's go to Palestine, yeah? On this example. You tell me, because I don't want to, and it's never the right time to do this, but I don't... What would an Islamic analysis of Zionism look like?
I mean, that's a really good question.
I guess that's what I
haven't really heard.
Yeah.
Like,
what is it? Is it a disease of the heart? Yeah. Is it hubris?
I mean, a lot of
like
Sufis might say.
Yeah, I don't know. That's like, so help us analyze the violence and why it's occurring. Now, I know we can say it's wrong. I know we can say killing and all the rest, but what would it look? And I'm just, or if we go beyond Zionism, what are the origins of racism? And you may say, and I think if it's always reduced to something like the disease of one's heart, the hubris, the arrogance of Bani Adam, whatever, but it's also, there's a material political reality to it that has occurred from something. Why have we done this? Why has the modern world built this? Why has an absence of Islam allowed this to occur? And what can the presence of Islam do to oppose it? And what is it? You don't have to even use the phrase. You don't have to go with racism. You can come up with your own categorization for this type of violence that occurs. That's what I'm asking. And I think we should lead with that as more than we lead with what is right or wrong. Because the right or wrong is important, don't get me wrong. But and the only point I was trying to say is that secularism allows for that. Right? And for me, it's a play of power. It will allow Muslims to declare what their faith says about X, Y, and Z, but what it will not allow is for their faith to build something, right? And part of that building is an analysis of the way the world works.
Don't you think, though, that I definitely am on board with what you're saying, but will be ultimately tied down to our sectarian loyalties. So I don't know if you saw, it was during the rounds, Facebook post, I forgot the guy on Facebook is, I've actually had some discussions with him prior, and he's known to be like more Sufi oriented and spiritual, that sort of stuff. He said that he had a conversation with Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, who said that there's nothing good from Hamas because they're Qutbi and Salafists. So in the case of what you're saying, like what is Zionism and an Islamic take, there will be different, like, I'm just hypothesizing off the top of my head, like some Salafis would be like, yeah, it's, I don't know, disease of the heart, and the resistance to that is Salafis, and there's not going to be any good from it, that kind of thing. And then there might be jihadists will be like, we have to do jihad, we have to fight. So like we're going to be tied down to these sectarian sort of.
Sure, of course we are.
Does that make sense?
Also, Zionism can't be described that way. You know, I think Zionism comes from historical, political reality that Jews have experienced in Europe and elsewhere, right? So you're right. Now to get to the sectarian point, like we have to have an analysis that helps explain and what theorizing is providing patterns, and let that be the dictating factor. So if somebody comes in and says, my sectarian view says this, but it doesn't explain 80% of Zionist behavior, then we don't reject it, but we recognize it's not helping us do what our aim is to try to understand. And secondly, there doesn't have to be agreement. There's no, in any discipline, in any field, you'll have different schools of thought, different ways. Our job is to have conversations and participate in it. And to repeat the point, there has to be some form of analysis grounded in our text. And the secularizing approach is to just make religion a moral voice. And I don't think I think morality will be everywhere, but just a moral voice is deeply limiting. On the issue of that, first of all, Hamas is not Qutbist and it's not Salafi. These are just words put together. That's not true. So take that analysis. It's simply not true. Anybody who reads the history of Hamas, right? I think you can maybe squint your eyes a little bit and say, okay, Hamas grew out of some time of the Ikhwan, and the Ikhwan had some type of relationship with Sayyid Qutb. But then where do you bring Salafis into this? Or maybe they are it's really strange. It's a strange analysis. But also, Hamas is born out of occupation, right? Hamas is born out of a political context, right? And so so we would have to provide. And by the way, I don't think that's an Islamic analysis. I think that's just using Islamic labels that we're familiar with, right? An analysis might explain why, I don't know, terrorism, quote unquote, armed resistance fails because of X, Y, and Z, or why it succeeds, or why the problem happens. And mind you, an analysis wouldn't just be about Muslim behavior. I'm talking about the world's behavior, right? So not just what we are doing, but what the world is doing, where we are in the world today. I just think that's important. But again, I don't want to overdo it because it may well be out there. And I just feel like the public dominant Islam that comes to us through social media and everything like that is mostly overly moralizing in its voice. And again, that's not a negation of we shouldn't have morality. Absolutely, we should.
Yeah, I think as well, on a larger scale, whatever is beneficial or fits the state imperative will be championed on an ideological sense, like in the sense of, in the case of taking Australian context, maybe the Saudi Arabia context, it would suit them to either support like Sufi scholars in the quietest sense, or, you have Madkhalis, for example, that champion like a Muslim ruler, quote unquote, right? And I guess in the case that you're talking about secularism, it would be more beneficial for the Australian government to be championing as the good role model Muslim, like the more secular oriented Muslims. So power works in interesting ways in order to, I guess, continue its justification or whatever actions it's doing on a state level to be justified, right? And so for us, like, it kind of goes back to the conversation of speaking back and knowing how much we care, and on a level of, on a physical level or a material level, changing the narrative in that regard, and what we should. But
also, I don't. Yes, there are multiple actors and multiple pressure points and multiple reasons why people say what they say. Of course, I think rather than us look to land in a particular place, we should focus on striving. I don't know about you, but I think we can have conversations with different positions in the Muslim Ummah on this issue. And the conversation will be beneficial rather than each in anyone's position, if that makes sense. For example, let's say neo-trads, sorry for using that phrase, It's one that popped into my head. They probably do bring something incredibly valuable to this debate. Yeah, and so do maybe Islamists. And I'm not saying that we will come to a consensus, but the conversation can be educational to all of us. Parts of our community reminding us not to let politics sway us too far away from our ultimate purpose and being in this dunya. Yeah, others may remind of our obligation to defend each other and Muslims. So the conversation is important. I don't think they should be happening in isolation to one another, but I do think you're right. The state will preference and privilege the type of Muslim conversation it wants for itself. We don't have to follow, but unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. But yeah, I'm for that conversation. The discourse rising up and raising all of us with it.
So is because you talked about us being too secular in that regard when it comes to having these conversations. Just I guess what we see on social media and from many Muslims, we see secularism, liberalism lumped together. I guess this would be a good time to kind of clarify when you get called like a liberal, like they're being too liberal. What does that really mean in that regard, or what does the term actually mean?
I haven't seen it in this context. I don't know. I haven't seen it in this context.
I guess in the context of like liberals fighting on the ground. I mean, in terms of activism on the ground.
Yeah, look, there's lots to say about, I think, the mistake some of us made by falling into the cultural wars. None of us, may Allah ease the suffering of Palestinians and the Ummah large, wanted this to happen. But I think one of the things that came out of this happening is some people had an unfortunate, they didn't have to pay the price, Palestinians had to pay the price, an unfortunate lesson on how far they misinterpreted this whole cultural wars debate, how far they focused on things that I think were overdone. Feminism, liberalism, who's a liberal, God, man, they won't do it now, but we know there were people who were promoting not only Jordan Peterson, but also Ben Shapiro, right? And it was so easy to see that when it came to Muslim and Arab deaths, when it came to something like Zionism or war, whose side they'd be on. But we had this nonsensical and obsessive idea that the real threat is trying to trace how much liberalism is in each Muslim. Okay, that's an important project, only important insofar as much it can be traced back to how it oppresses us. That's it. If we want to know what liberalism is, it is a dominant ideology in the West that many of us live in. Emphasizes on individual rights, and its worst expression makes it an overly permissive idea where your consensus alone in your individual project and it alone is all that you should invest your time in. Okay. It's an alternative creed. Sure. Are we impacted by it? Absolutely. Are we influenced in ways we know? Yes. In ways we don't know? Yes. Is it important to have a conversation around it? Yes. But that conversation around it has to be tied into the way the modern world has been built, and we lack self-determination. There's no generosity in highlighting a Muslim is liberal if you can't tie it back to how that same Muslim has lacked the opportunity to self-determine themselves as a Muslim. There's no point in it. If you and I sit here and say, okay, well, you're liberal because you're out there doing this stuff. Yeah, well, your family came here for a reason, right? You're trying, you're doing all of this and whatnot. And I just didn't think the over-policing of it is necessary unless it's tied to an overall project of the way we as Muslims lack self-determination globally, politically speaking. That's where the debate begins and ends. It's the same with feminism, same with LGBTQ stuff. Like, it has to be framed within an overall, the moral outrage of how it's un-Islamic and so forth. Okay, as long as it's tied to a bigger project, and it didn't seem tied to it. So in this context now, where we're seeing the liberals, the secularists, the socialists, the left, all coming out for pro-Palestine, and some people's ex-buddies are not only just Zionists, they're quite clearly Islamophobic, right? Maybe there's a lesson to be learnt in that these debates around what is and what isn't liberalism has to be tied into debates about what is and what isn't the West, and what the West is materially, politically, and militarily. There's no point on debating culture otherwise for me. So there's some awkward moments that comes out of this, but that's politics is full of tensions and stresses and contexts and awkwardnesses. Yeah, I'm also at the stage I couldn't care less, man, who's a liberal right now. Like, when you see what's coming out of Gaza, I'm just my head's not there. I just don't want to focus on that right now.
I think for me, like, for example, the whole Jordan Peterson phenomena, like, this was many years ago. Muslims loved him so much because he's speaking against, woke, quote unquote, woke stuff, and people just lapped him up. And then there was the whole debate with Mohammed Hijab and Jordan Peterson, that discussion that they had. And every channel or anyone that was reviewing that talk was basically saying this is amazing progress, this and that. I would say, as Boys in the Cave, we're literally one of the very few, I'm not saying in the world, that were literally pointing out so many issues with that, and also the issues with Jordan Peterson before. And we did get a lot of hate. And then later down the line, because it was clear, like, if us, some Muslims that have that political project of aligning with things that are like reactionary in the sense of against woke people and gay, and let's just align with Christian conservatives, and that's kind of their only political project. I've seen it's very common. I think in the States you hear it quite a lot as well. And the conversation later then switched, because clearly he's no matter how many conversations you're going to have with him, he still advocates for the bombing of innocents of Muslims. And so it took that long for the warning signs were there, but the fact that, we lapped it up. He was literally invited to Masajid. He was like invited as some savior, and Muslim, savior in that regard from the non-Muslim camp. But then I'm just disgusted that it's like, we're just that easy to bring someone into our community like that, and then to be saying the things he did. It's like, that's how vile and disgusting of a human being is. And I pointed this out, and I'm saying that in the context of Israel and Palestine, and how he's just sided with Israel. Like, I know that now people hate him, are disgusted by him, but I'm just more disgusted that we allowed this in the first place, to be him being invited. But then I mentioned that, but people are like, oh no, like, you shouldn't point out the people that got it wrong initially, because at least they're voicing their concerns now. But I'm like, fair enough, like, they're rectifying their mistakes. Not that they're admitting it, but they're just speaking out against it. But the fact that they had those bad ideas or those narratives or that thought process before that led them to Jordan Peterson having this platform amongst Muslims, this and that. It's literally, we need to have that introspection, but that's missed. It's just like, oh, he's speaking against Israel, speaking for Israel now. Now let's cancel him. But it's like, the warning signs were there way before. So that's why I was just frustrated in that regard.
The frustration I share. But look, it goes back to that point. And again, it's a difficult point for me to make because I'm cautious of not doing it justice. But it's because there's been a century of secularizing Muslims. And what I mean by that is that we think the dominant voice is for us to be a moral voice, and the LGBTQ issue, feminism, liberalism, is often a moral debate about what liberalism should allow permissible and whatnot, and Muslims participate in that because saying no to these things is a powerful voice. And here we have Jordan Peterson, who's unafraid, and the exaggeration of the encroachment of the woke crowd and all this. Look, empires do what they do, man. Like at the back of the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, about the back of end of the war on terror, if you assume it has ended. And yeah, we had lots and lots of disgruntled people against establishment, and then establishment comes out, and some Muslims decide to join into this debate when they probably didn't need to. I don't even know what they're trying to save. I don't understand what they're trying to rescue or preserve. I don't know. So yeah, the Jordan Peterson things became obvious, but this is what I mean by when our dominant voice is a moralizing voice and it lacks a political analysis, an Islamic analysis of power and the way it works. Because it was very, very clear what Jordan Peterson is. It's very, very clear. It wasn't even difficult, man. It was clear. And Ben Shapiro even more so. But if you're only focused, if you think religion, quote, only focus is on the private life, right? On you as an individual, on the family life, which is a conservative thing. So here's the other thing. They are liberals, man, but they think like in America, they think liberals are progressives, right? They're just conservatives, like, and the focus on family, tradition, church, and so forth. They're just conservatives. Peterson is not new. His narrative is not new, right? Maybe it's new to some. Maybe social media propelled it. Whatever. It's not new. There was always going to be a conservative backlash to the encroachments made by Me Too and Black Lives Matter. Always, right? It is what it is, but like this idea that we have an obligation to focus only on the private matters in life, it was a strange time. And then to come after things like critical race theory, that one till this day I don't understand. I don't get it. I don't understand what their problem was. It's astonishing that it went all the way up to Trump. Yeah, like critical race theory is a problem, and to this day, I'm shook by how absurd it is. I don't care. Most criticisms weren't even criticisms. They were moral panics. They were outraged. I've never heard a legitimate criticism from that side. Yeah, and then they would disguise it with attempts to sound intellectual. It lacks moral objectivism. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't. But all that aside, when it comes to the issue of Palestine now, right? Now you see, unfortunately, to have this lesson that power will only employ you when it wants to and will disregard you and you don't matter. Right? He doesn't care. He's not sitting there counting lost Muslim subscribers. They got what they wanted, right? And that was to employ us in a fight against things like decolonization and critical race theory. Yeah. And I'll tell you now, critical race theory will do a better explanation to what Israel is doing to Palestinians than what Jordan Peterson is saying. It will provide you a better explanation to why Palestinians are being killed than what Jordan Peterson is saying, right? But if you excluded and ignored all of that because the dude told you to make a bed and be a strong man, okay, man, you've missed the point. But I'll be curious to see where we will be in a year around this stuff. I'll be curious. But let me just say this, credit where it's due to Daniel H., to Muhammad Hijab for calling them out. Even though they got seduced a little bit by it, at least now they're calling them a lot. At least now they didn't follow. Yeah? They're calling it out. So, alhamdulillah for that, I guess.
Speaking of Daniel H., we actually had the pleasure of meeting him recently. That's another podcast, mate. Yeah. But in terms of, because we talked about liberalism, would you be able to shed light on how racism plays into liberalism, so that relationship?
Historically, it will be very, very difficult for two parts. Historically, it will be very, very difficult for us to tell the success of liberalism without telling the story of the success of racism. So they go side and side. So whenever that happens, we have to recognize that liberalism was not able to stop racism, but actually benefited from it. Let me try and explain what that means. Yeah, Australia is a liberal society, right? And its success materially, politically, whatever you want to say, if it is indeed a success, how did liberalism live comfortably with what Australia did to Indigenous Australia? How did it live comfortably? So that's one thing that we have to examine, because ultimately liberalism allows for and benefits from what colonialism did. That's one. But also the dominance of the Western world allowed space for the dominance of Western ideas. Right? It must eradicate and suppress other ideas, because those ideas would resist the Western modern colonial project. So there's an intrinsic relationship between it. Now you could go a little bit further, deeper into the philosophical idea of liberalism itself. Who is the abstract individual at the heart of liberalism? Where does it come from? Is it merely the reflection and mirror of the white male figure who renamed themselves human, who renamed themselves abstract, who made the law and the observation of the world from the prism of what liberalism built, and in doing so did not call itself white but called itself universal? There's those arguments to be made, right? And then there's arguments that liberalism began, first and foremost, had nothing to do with what we think it has to do. It had only to do with an internal European conflict between monarchies, church, and the mercantile caste, the property owner. And so it comes from that conflict, and the property owner won, in effect, and created a political order that had to deal with and diminish the power of the church and the monarchy. And then eventually it expands. It expands to include women, and it expands to include citizens who are not white, and so forth. And it moves on, and now we've got a liberalism that can't deal with its expansion, because now it has to accommodate thick differences, not just thin ones. Yes, you're free, Tanzim, to be who you want to be, but if you bring the Sharia, no, you're not free. Right, because the Sharia is an underlining of assumption about the way the world ought to be, and a disruption of the liberal order. So now we come into this kind of liberal phase of its expansion where it cannot accommodate significant differences, and then we get backlashes, conservative backlashes, and so forth. And then there is an idea within liberalism that has often been weaponized. The wars against us are because you're illiberal. Right, and then there's another argument, maybe this is where I'd be interested in, maybe in an Islamic spiritual reading, that liberalism breeds a type of hubris, dominance over the world. The primary observer is no longer God, the primary observer is the individual. The primary lawmaker is no longer God, the primary lawmaker is the individual. The primary right giver and right receiver is no longer divinely ordained. It is, I am through my consent. Yeah, there's all sorts of different debates to have through an Islamic analysis about whether or not the relegating of God to the private space has created all sorts of fitna and corruption. Possibly. Yes, so liberalism and its relationship with racism, it will be very, very hard to decouple the two. It also has fought against racism, to be fair, and that's the thing about the West. It is a family of ideologies that often quibble and contest with each other, right? And so liberalism has many iterations in it. Some are against it, and some evoke civil rights, some as a fight against racism. Others claim that liberalism's first and foremost project is to protect the liberal state, which will create racial policing, etc., etc. Complicated debate, but whether we should or should not be liberals I don't trust the social media space, because what they think liberalism means is you're free to be whatever you want to be. And this is the biggest nonsense that they spread. That in the Western society, it promotes freedom. It's such a reduction. Mate, what freedom? Okay, relatively speaking, sure, but there's a reason why places, say, hypothetically, Egypt is less free than here, because the political context is completely different. A free Egypt might mean different things for America and Israel, right? But here, I don't know how free you all think you are. I really don't. I look around and I say, what does that mean? So the idea that liberalism is this all-pervasive, be whoever you want to be, garbage. That's not true.
I think, ironically, for the one that is more secular-minded in the way you were describing, the moralizing aspect would determine how free you are. So like in the case of like LGBTQ and exercising your desires, or all that like kind of points that are made about the nafs and not having restraint on those nafs is brought into the conversation about liberal.
Possibly, but let's be like, don't exclude don't reduce politics to values and ideals and so forth. And I go with the LGBTQ stuff. It's not just about these things. It's about how people live. But ask yourself how you live. How free are you really? Honestly, just ask yourself that question. Try not working. Try not participating in the social norms of this society and see how free you are. Materially speaking, we are very, very commonly chained to either debt, to consumption patterns, to sustaining a life. And we are very, very often, every dollar we make, significant part of that dollar goes to somebody else. Right? So there's ways to understand freedom, and there are other ways to understand freedom. Some of us are just completely overworked. And maybe the quicker you go up the ladder, but then you look at colonially speaking, well, people who are 7-8 generations who have inherited wealth from the benefits of colonialism are more free than those who are at the other end of that colonial scale, who have to start again, whose mother and father, when they first came here, had 2-3 jobs. So you can ask yourself all you want, but the idea that the West is this bastion of individual free expression, come on, man. Take a closer analysis. That's not reality, right? That's not reality. And that's what I mean. If you're going to provide me an Islamic analysis and it just begins and ends with, this is not Islam and this is Islam and we shouldn't dress like this and shouldn't speak like this, and okay, but sure.
Yeah. I think talking about freedom, flowing into this discussion would be a good way to segue is about censorship online. So there's been wide censorship about any pro-Palestinian content online. There have been people that have gotten banned, or pro-Palestine pages that have been deleted of Instagram, like in the millions. And there was also on LinkedIn, there was this whole thing about flagging people who are pro-Palestine, and then, blacklisting on the website and all this sort of stuff. So it's been some crazy things happening in that regard. So I think you can get flagged if you're like, if you have pro-Palestine content, and then that they might inform your employer. So like it becomes very detrimental in that regard.
I've got the Palestinian flag on my LinkedIn.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't mind. Let them flag. Let them tell my employer. I don't mind.
Yeah. So there's a lot of censorship that's happening online. Like, what are your thoughts about that, and how can we, as
everything can be suspended in freedom, because the way liberal order works, and this is what something that the Muslim right needs to understand. Yeah. Everything in the West, historically and otherwise, gets suspended and regulated and controlled through the prism of security. They will suspend everything on the grounds, that they have to protect not freedom, but the conditions of freedom. So in their mind, they're like, we will take away your civil liberties, your security, your free speech, etc., etc. If they can make an argument that taking it away is for protecting the conditions of freedom, because you're a threat to freedom. So if they can make the argument that pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, pro-blah, blah, 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 whatever, disrupts order, creates tension, they'll take it away. The only problem is that the people making these decisions are the ones who are also interpreting what disruption looks like and what security looks like. And it's racialized, right? Yeah. And so this freedom has never been the thing that we think it is. It has always been placed within certain contexts. And that's why they could argue that they can spy on your phones and take material from its phones. Why? That's why they make you wear seatbelts. Or if you're truly free and you're an adult, why is the state forcing you to wear a seatbelt? Why? Because in their argument, well, it harms other people when you don't wear a seatbelt. You become a potentially harmful projectile, or that the first responders have to deal with it. So they will they will always make an argument that we have to protect security against pure freedom. And we don't have it. The problem is, racially speaking, some people are designated as bigger threats than others. And that's the problem. So when we go out there as Muslims and start talking about the West as if it's all free and embracing and allows you to do whatever, but suddenly you're not allowed to protest against Palestine, what that says to me is that you never figured out what the West actually was. You actually believed its myth. It's not this thing. You're not allowed to talk about this. You know, it is. Go on a map and look at how many countries have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. Go have a look, and you will see a Western alliance. Go have a look at the map, right? And that was part of the frustration, is that a lot of people, when they speak about Western hypocrisy, are often speaking about a broken idea that they had of this West being anything other than hypocritical. The West cares about the West. That's it. That's it. It's not hypocritical. They'll say, do, fight, be whoever they need to be to protect their interests. And it is what it is. That's why writing a letter to the MP about Palestine for me is like, okay, if you want to do it, do it. Or I'm going to try to convince, but at the end of the day, you're going to try to convince me that the Australian state is going to go against the US for Palestine? No chance. It won't. Because its security and economic interests align with the West, especially when it has to deal with China. And what are you going to do? Well, some MP is going to go up and say what? And there's the other part of it, brother. I don't know how to say. They know. Power knows. Are you honestly trying to tell me that there are people in the Australian government that doesn't see what Israel is doing? Of course they do. They also know they can't say anything. Not because there's some Zionist lobby that will punish them, right? Because of the caucus consensus idea of Australian interest comes first. They don't want disruption. And sorry to say it, you don't count as much as we think we count. I'm not saying they hate us. I'm not saying, but it's just a basic political reading. The West isn't what we make it out to be often. There is freedom, but it's freedom within the context of security, and security always comes first.
So in the case of security, it's really important how you highlighted that we have to reorient our understanding of what the West is, because the point you made, but we actually fall for the myth that the West...
some of us sound heartbroken. Some of us literally sound heartbroken. Oh, dear PM, we brought you to the steps only 2 days ago to speak about the Yes campaign. And the very next day, like they sound heartbroken. They sound like, I'm like, what? The two things are not going to be related, right? We often sound like when we're highlighting Western hypocrisy or them letting us down, that somehow we believed in the idea that they will listen to you if you have truth. Yes, they will. But that truth will never, ever get in the way of the state's security. Ever. And the problem is the state's security is built on how they see security. Not often, in my opinion, on reality, because a secure Middle East, means a free Palestine. Okay? But that goes against the interests of Israel.
So in the case of censorship on social media and on the internet, what can us Muslims do in regards to that? Because that is obviously going to affect the way we do activism and putting our messaging out and all that sort of stuff as well.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what you can do. I'm not on social media because I don't like it. But it's important. Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
What's stopping us from building our own social media platforms?
I mean, everyone's just so reliant on the big ones, Instagram, Facebook, and they would feel that the other ones that are made properly, quote unquote, aren't to that level because the usership is just too much.
They're not going to be that level today. They're not going to be that level today. But they could be in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. What's stopping you from building your own media?
I mean, I would say that those social media platforms have ties. Like the reason why Facebook does the censorship is because they have ties with Israel, right? So like it always goes back to that.
Yeah, but just like what do we not have people that can program it? I'm confused. I'm just like, why can't you have your own Muslims or anything that is not tied to Israel? Like, why can't you make your own? I'm not even sure about Facebook's relationship, right? But I just feel like us saying that Facebook is not politically neutral is ridiculous. Of course it's not. Neither is Macca's, man. Like, why do we need to go there? Genuine question. Build your own platform. There's enough of us. There's enough consumers. We don't need to go there, but we do go there, and then we complain that these hosts aren't hosting us properly. What would you do if you went to a host that didn't host you properly? You'd leave. Just leave. You don't need it, man. Like, I don't know how hard it is to create. I don't know. I'm assuming it's not that hard, but it could be. But the problem is, we all go there. And this is the point. Will I really lose my 70,000, 100,000, 150,000 followers? Yeah. To go to a Muslim.
Or my 800 followers on Instagram.
Would I really lose it all? Yeah. And most answers would be no. Keep both, man. Keep both. But just build your own.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think it is difficult in that regard, having to create that traction for people to come on. I think that would be
literally this morning, bro. I was thinking about creating an alternative to Starbucks and calling it River to the Sea Coffee, bro. And you're trying to tell me that we wouldn't shop there, man? I'm not sure. I'm sure we wouldn't. I'm sure it wouldn't be successful, right? But this is part of the activism. The activism isn't to continually keep telling each other that the West doesn't listen to you, doesn't accommodate you, that it's hypocritical. Like, how many times do you need to be told that politicians lie? How many times? How many times? How many times do you need to feel like you've been let down for voting Labour or voting Liberal? How many times? It's like, at one point, it becomes your problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share in terms of thoughts. Okay. All right. Yep. No worries. I'll wrap it up. I guess we've covered a lot of ground anyway, alhamdulillah. But last one question. This was brought up last night about Susan Carline's Instagram story. What did she post? She said something about. Doing this to me, man. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What is she posting in?
I think it was an amnesty. I'm not sure about the legitimacy of it, but it was her Instagram or something. Yeah, somebody sent it to me.
Pull it up now, actually. It says Palestine. So who's Susan Carline, by the way? Just to.
She's an academic from Melbourne Uni. I think she's doing her DECRA on, which is a research grant on Islamophobia. She's been fairly well-known Muslim voice in the last 20 odd years. She's also Walid Ali's wife. They've been fairly active in mainstream spaces around Muslim experiences, I think. Yeah.
She did a story, it was last night.
Oh, she's also the author of the book Hislam.
Hislam, yeah. She shared a story last night on her Instagram. Palestinian armed groups must be held accountable for deliberate civilian killings, abductions, and indiscriminate attacks. But to be fair, she's actually posted more after. She said, demand a ceasefire to end civilian suffering. But the fact that she posted that as the first story, and people have noted that she's never posted anything about Palestine, like during this whole conflict, like nothing's being posted, and then suddenly it's like, this is the first thing you post, you know what I mean?
Yeah, what's your question?
No, I just wanted to get your thoughts on. Look, are you surprised by that? Are you not? Or?
I made a commitment to myself that I'm not going to come after Muslims during this particular moment of time. Sure. But I will say this, unless they're harmful to the Palestinian cause. And I think this post is a bit harmful. Let me just say it this way, whether it's Susan or anybody else, we don't need to say out loud that was it Palestinian armed resistance?
Yeah.
Didn't even mention Hamas, right? So we don't need to say out loud that Hamas or anybody else should be held responsible. We don't need to say it out loud. The reason why we don't need to say it out loud is because Israel's already doing that. Not only is it trying to take Hamas responsible. It's punishing Palestinians as well. We don't need to say the terrorists, quote unquote, the resistance fighters, quote unquote, Hamas, quote unquote, need to be held responsible for what they did. Israel is doing that, and it's doing that in the most grotesque and violent way by collectively punishing people. Right? Did Hamas get away with it? Now, people say, oh yeah, well, they weren't caught. You leveled entire buildings. You want Palestinians to blame them. You are telling the entire world all these deaths that are happening in Palestine are because of Hamas, right? So is there really a necessity to come out in this moment when they've cut off electricity, bombing schools, hospital infrastructures, all the rest, right? And have a history of doing this, when these people are defensiveless, don't have an army, don't have a military or a navy or an air force, and are being bombed from up, and there's reports of white phosphorus, there's reports of all sorts of different types of cruel ways to oppress these people, cutting off water, all the rest, all these reports. Like it, don't like it, say what, that sounds very, very likely. On top of all of that, it's 75 years of occupation. On top of all of that, it's 16 years of siege and blockade in Gaza. Okay? Do you really, really need to come out at this particular moment when Palestinians have been collectively punished to say, we need to hold Hamas accountable? The opposite needs to be said, because it's quite clear to anyone who understands politics that the powers to be, that the biggest powers in the world are going to hold Hamas accountable, right? To the point they want to destroy Hamas completely. We know this. Biden said it. Okay? Anyone with any form of power in Israel has said it. Do you really need to come out and add that? On the flip side are you confident that Israel is going to be pulled before a world court for humanitarian crimes? Are you confident? I'm not. I'm not confident at all. Biden's already questioning the numbers. Don't trust the Gaza Health Ministry. So you're coming out, and to me, when I see these posts by anyone, not just Susan, it's just a flag to everybody out there that she's a good person, that she's a humanitarian person, that she sees bad on both sides. That for me is centering your sensibilities or how you see yourself above a reality that's happening. I'll leave it on this analogy. If you had two kids and one of those kids had, I don't know, man, a kitchen knife, right? And another kid had an axe. And another kid was bigger. And they're both fighting. You're really going to come out and say, hey, both of you, stop fighting. Everyone instinctively, intuitively will try to stop the kid with the axe because they know they can do far more damage. Right? Everyone. But if you're going to say, I condemn both of you, right? Rather than recognizing that the violence, and it's not even that the kid with the knife started it anyway. Right? That's on top of all of that. Okay? But that's the problem with taking two sides. Because it's just a moral argument. It's not one grounded in reality. It's not one grounded. And then the ridiculousness and the inhumanity of saying they're hiding behind civilians. What's the proportionality of the debate, of the attack? How should Israel defend itself? Hamas is terrorist. All the while, we are seeing hundreds daily, hundreds of Palestinian civilians being killed and displaced, and their buildings and their homes and their lives destroyed. Nah, man, it's pointless. It's useless. It's not the time for it. It's absolutely not the time for it. And here's another thing. There are many, many alternatives. Israel could have said, we give you 72 hours to hand over those responsible for the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October so they can be brought to trial. It could have done that. It could have done that. No, it's going to go in, bomb everything that it sees. Right? Why are you coming out saying they should be held responsible? Let them be held responsible legally. Make that argument at least. If they had added the phrase, they should be legally held responsible without collective punishment, okay, we're with you. But to throw that in, and final point here, whether they meant it, didn't mean it, whether those who say it is the Zionist narrative that what it is doing is because it's a retaliation of what Hamas has done. And that narrative is only half true. The other half is what Hamas is doing is because of what Zionist Israel has done to Palestinians. And that narrative has to be like either say the whole narrative or don't say any of it at all.
The final point? Yeah. Oh, okay. I appreciate your time. Like, I think we covered a lot of ground, alhamdulillah. Hopefully this is the platform where you're able to really express what you wanted to express, because I know we talked about different media outlets and stuff you're not able to express in the way you're you sort of want. So I appreciate your time. Early in the morning as well. I'm gonna head off to Palestine protests as well today, inshallah. But yeah, it was an honor to have you and have this conversation. I think it's really important. And Boys in the Cave, we actually haven't done an episode in a long time. Apologies for that. Had a lot of things change, moved interstate, all that sort of stuff. So we'll get that into the works, inshallah. But hopefully you'll benefit from this talk. Please support us on our socials, on Facebook, on Instagram. Send us a message. We have group chats that we talk about all this sort of stuff. So hop onto our broadcast channel as well on Instagram and reach out to me as well if you want to. But, spread this file right and, keep up with your activism, especially for the Palestinians, because they need our help in any way, shape or form as well, inshallah. So from our special guests, Yassir and myself, wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.